And we are live. Welcome, welcome to my channel where you've never appeared before, have you?
Never. I'm completely new. No one knows who I am.
If you would like to introduce yourself for that person that doesn't know who you are.
I am Bookborn from the channel Bookborn, and I talk about fantasy and sci-fi, and Liana and I like to be salty together and sometimes positive.
I
So
feel like we're quite positive about our saltiness. You know, we're upbeat. It's not really a downer.
that's true. We're upbeat about our saltiness. I'm just like, what positive live shows have we done? American Gods.
American Gods. And I'm sure I'll think of one.
Sort of Best Served Cold. But
Best or cold.
I mean, it was like mostly positive. So
I think our TBR swaps weren't utterly disastrous. There was some positivity
that's
in
true.
there.
That's true. There was. And we talked about the heroes once.
Yeah.
On a podcast. That was positive too.
Yeah.
But that's about it.
But I feel like we are quite positive, even if we're True. Generally ranting and being salty. So anyway, we are here today where we're allowed to rant once again, but we're also going to be positive. It's going to be both. We're talking about good and bad adaptations. What makes an adaptation good? What makes an adaptation bad? And then some of our favorites and least favorites. We'll probably talk about those throughout, but at the end we can just completely off-road and just start fangirling about the ones we like and venting about the ones we hate.
Perfect.
So hello, Beth. Hello, Urza. Hello. So yeah, I mean, obviously, there's been a lot of adaptations recently. That's kind of why we're doing this. We've both been covering quite a few of them. It's both a great time and a terrible time to be a fan of SFF adaptations because there's a lot. There are a ton out there right now, so that's good. The execs, the people with money, have finally realized after years and years that nerdiness is cool, SFF is cool, and it's not
just that
like
nerds have money. And they will spend cash. That's
nerds have money. Yes, we're here to talk about Dear Evan Hansen, correct? So
Jenny Nicholson said anything there was to be said about Dear Evan Hansen, so you guys can go watch that.
Yeah, just watch all of Jenny Nicholson's content. Don't watch our channels. Just go watch Jenny Nicholson.
Just go watch Jenny Nicholson.
Way better.
Yeah.
But I feel like, I mean, I think, I guess I was going to say we were going to talk about it anyway, but I'll just start there with Lord of the Rings. But when Lord of the Rings, the films came out, they were sort of the exception, not the rule. They were one of the few fantasy things out at the time. It wasn't like you had a bunch of sci-fi, fantasy, big budget movies or television shows. Is extremely new to have the budget and the resources to do it on TV, other than Xena the Warrior Princess, full CGI, full movie quality stuff. So Lord of the Rings is kind of a gold standard, but also it was kind of by itself too. So everyone saw it, because if you were a fan of SFF, it's not like there were 50 things to keep up with. That was the only one for a very long time.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you think of the Lord of the Rings, they took a lot of risks. And I think people don't remember that because it's just so successful now. But I remember in particular, one of the risks they took is that they filmed all three at the same time. And they talked a lot about what a risk that was, because if it didn't perform, they were out of a lot of money. And sometimes, I can't prove this, but sometimes I do feel like some of the less no fact. The less successful adaptations today, I do feel like, are lacking any risk. Sometimes I'm like, you were just so afraid to do anything that nothing was accomplished. Mm-hmm. And again, it's funny to think of the Lord of the Rings as a risk, since it is just so in our, everybody just knows about it, and it just is. It's so successful. But they took a lot of risks, and they did a lot of things.
That could be said. Obviously, it's not always 100% across the board, but I think a lot of the time, the ones that, and I guess not just adaptations in general, creative endeavors, the ones that were a risk are the ones that we remember as being successes. Certainly there are risks that didn't pay off, but it's rare that something that is considered bankable by that something is considered a classic where the story behind it is oh yeah, the CEO signed off on that immediately. Everyone knew this would be a hit, and it was when will you guys learn that when you cookie cutter manufacture something where you think you've checked all the popularity boxes, that is 0% chance of succeeding.
It's so true. Any super, super successful thing, Literally every single one is like, no one thought this was going to be successful. Like literally anytime, Star Wars, even like recently Hamilton. Like I love reading about how everyone was like, no, this is a terrible idea. You should not do this.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, like you said, there's tons of bombs that also
Mm-hmm.
have that. But it is interesting to see that like almost every successful thing has that in its story. Like they're risky because that's what's going to be art. Like you said, if it's cookie cutter, it's probably just not going to mean a lot to anybody.
I feel like if you look at a timeline, it's like a risky thing that paid off and then copycats, a risky thing that paid off and then copycats, a risky thing that paid off and then copycats.
In a vein, I feel like you and I have talked about that a lot with like the strong female character. Like a good female character will come out and then like a million copycats that don't understand why it was successful. Like Katniss, that's the really famous one. Like the Hunger Games, you saw a million Katniss copycats and none of them came close to the original.
That's because usually I feel like there's part of it that's a lack of creativity when you're just copying something, but there's also a lack of understanding of what made it successful in the first place. It's a very surface level understanding, be it a female character or a story or whatever. So someone who takes Lord of the Rings and cynically is like, oh, what made this successful is that there are sweeping landscape shots, an epic score, and a large cast. And that's all I need. If I do that, then people will like it. And that's not the secret sauce. Like those are great things that make it a beautiful film. And those are certainly like pluses. Like those are good things about those films, but that's not what makes them. And so in the copycats, they emulate only the surface level. I mean, Game of Thrones copycats are the same, where they're like, oh, what you want is violence. Got it. And you're like, I mean, yes, there was violence in Game of Thrones and people did find that refreshing as compared to more traditional fantasies like Lord of the Rings. They're like, oh, fantasy could be edgy. I didn't know. So like, yes, that was a plus, but it's not like Game of Thrones was just Lord of the Rings with blood. Like that's not what made it a success. So,
but that's what they thought because they did know, well, it's a lack of understanding of writing and characters and what makes a successful story. And I think that's what I'm personally seeing in the Rings of Power. It's not like I think it's so
going
dismal.
for it.
Like, I am. I'm just going for it. I really have been like thinking like they put in tons of characters and they put in interesting things without any understanding of how it works. And, you know, I was thinking of other big casts. And so like one is the Stormlight Archive. What's interesting is everyone will be like, well, or the Wheel of Time. The Wheel of Time has a huge cast. The Stormlight Archive is a huge cast and no one complains about that. And they're complaining about Rings of Power. But if you look at those books, they actually start from a main perspective for quite a bit of time. Like
Lord of the Rings,
time,
by the end, by Return of the King, you have a lot of perspectives, but you didn't start with that.
You didn't start there. In fact, I'm going to be making a spreadsheet to prove it, but for my final video. But like Wheel of Time is a great example. You're with Rand for like 70% of the first book. And then even in the second book, you may have 4 perspectives, but they're all the main characters from the first book. And then it keeps adding. And same with Stormlight Archive. Something interesting about that is in the first book, we call it like the Kaladin's book, and the second one is Shallan's book. So even though they're secondary characters, Kaladin has the most chapters in every single part. And the same with the second one, Shallan. So someone carries the book. And what we're seeing in Rings of Power, no one carries it, not even Galadriel. It seemed like Galadriel in the beginning was going to.
Like if someone, then her, but like
then her.
Not really.
And that might have been smart, you know? But instead it's just like, we'll give you all of it in the first season. And there's just a lack of understanding of how you write a large cast of characters.
Well, it's also, I think, a lack of understanding of like when to do which thing. You know, it's the same as like, and I mean, we're here to talk about adaptation, so that'll be part of it, is like when it's something that should be true to the book because this really works on screen, and when it's a really bad idea to do it exactly like the book because that's not going to work on screen. And so the same thing of like, sometimes you need to have a bunch of different characters doing a bunch of different things. And that's what this story calls for. And sometimes this story calls for zeroing in on your main protagonist. And you need to know what story you're telling and then choose the appropriate medium and also like style of telling that story. And you can't just be like, well, this one did a bunch, so I guess we can do that. And you're like, because they did a bunch because that was appropriate for that story.
Yeah, and I think a good example of that is the end of the first Hunger Games. I don't know, did you like the Hunger Games adaptations?
I never read the books, and I only saw the movies like years later. Like that hype train missed me. When I eventually saw the movies, I was like, oh, this is pretty good.
So I read the books and was a huge fan of the books, and I'm also quite a huge fan of those adaptations, particularly the first one. So what you may not know is like the dogs at the end of that movie in the books, those are like generated from the dead contestants. So they have like their eyes and their features, and it's like this really traumatizing thing for Katniss.
It's pretty grim.
And it's a great thing in the book. I was so happy they didn't do it in the movie, because how could you possibly do that without it just being a cheese fest? And people complained about it, but I was like, good choice. Like, it's just that will not carry in a movie. And I think you have to understand like the mediums are different. And so reasons like, as much as I think the Scouring of the Shire is integral to the Lord of the Rings, I do understand why they took it out. And it was probably a smart decision, because the movie would just been too long. Like, that's not going to play in a movie like it plays in a book.
Well, there's a lot of things like that's why when I did see the films when I was a kid when they came out, and only years later read the books. So, there's maybe I would have hated the movies if I had loved the books first, but like, I'll never know. But when I read the book, and it is quite different in some respects, it's like truly, it's like a carbon copy. And in other respects, they took some liberties. But for the most part, I think people have come to respect the films, because when it took liberties, it was because a filmmaker was like, I am making a film. And no matter how much I love this book, if I make a film that is exactly like this book, it will make a terrible film. What makes a good book does not necessarily make a good film. So like all the times they stop to sing a song and recite a poem, you're like, in a movie, your story like grinds to a halt, and it would completely ruin the pacing and ruin the stakes and the tension, and it just wouldn't work. It is beautiful, and it is like part of the lore of the world, part of what makes it feel like this mythic world, and you lose that in the movie. But I don't think that the movie would be better if you suddenly stopped your adventure story to have Aragorn recite a poem. Like that wouldn't work.
They did bring in songs when they could. And they chose the appropriate moments for that. And I think the problem is, ultimately, I feel like what we're going to get is there's an intrinsic value that makes something good, and it's not easier. There's no formula. Right? That's the ultimate answer. You can't take a book and go, well, if we follow step A, B, C, D, E, we'll have a good adaptation. The problem is it does take someone with artistry. Like it's art. It's an art to do it. And so the people who hit gold hit golds. And I don't know what to say, other than I think some of these shows could have more editors. Like sometimes I'm like, did anyone watch this? Did anyone read this and edit it before you filmed it? Because it feels like if enough regular Joes can be like, this is questionable, someone in the writing team, I don't know.
Yeah. And I think
you're on a horse, but I talk that to death.
I don't understand that. But I mean, I'll give a lot more grace to something if I feel like it attempted to do something outside the box, and maybe it didn't work out. Maybe that was a terrible idea, but you tried to do a thing as opposed to just copying another thing. And I will always give points for the attempt at the audacity of creativity, So like if you're taking, I feel like the idea of copying some other adaptation is 100,000% always the wrong idea. You need to take the story you're telling and figure out what works for it, independent of what anyone else has ever done. And I mean, here and there, of course, artists, stand on the shoulders of the people that came before them, and something that you previously thought was unadaptable, if you see somebody adapt something that is in some respects similar and that it was possible, that can get your like wheels turning about, okay, maybe it's not impossible. How can I make this work? Because apparently it can. So like people said Dune is unadaptable. And originally I would have said the movie they made of it would have confirmed that it is unadaptable. But then comes along Denis Villeneuve. And of course there are changes, but that's why I compared Dune to the Lord of the Rings films, because he did for Dune what Peter Jackson did for Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. Dune was so good. I forgot. Did you tell me I liked Dune? Full disclosure, when Leanna told me to do this, I was like, oh no, I haven't liked any adaptations recently. And then you listed a bunch I liked and it made me feel better.
Yeah, I think I thought of Dune. I'm not sure if I said it. I was like, I've listed enough.
Someone did just say, you said, Shadow and Bone was really good. Although I have to admit, I read the book, like the Six of Crows books after. So sometimes I don't count it as much if I experienced the show first. I do feel like I tend to be less critical.
But I think this comes to like another point of conversation, which is, so like what makes a good adaptation, right? Other than just like, we've been talking about like making the right choices for your story, which is a big part of it. But there's also, is your adaptation only going to appeal to a fan of the book? Or is it only going to appeal to somebody who's never read the book? Or will it appeal to both? Ideally, it appeals to both. Someone who's read it and who's never read it will be equally engaged and, awestruck by what you've done.
You had loved Six of Crows before you watched it.
Yeah.
And did you think it was good?
Yeah, I thought it was amazing. And I think most fans of the books liked the adaptation.
And it definitely worked for me because Zach and I both were obsessed with the show, and that's why I read it, even though it was YA. Like, really, particularly the Six of Crows part of
they are
it.
the best part.
Yeah. Like the cat, like just everything about it was just
But it's
so
also
well
an
done.
example of a fandom very positively receiving huge changes. Like the fact that they took later books and mushed them together with the previous books and like fanficked an entire plot for this to work. Like that sounds like, when I heard they were doing that, I was like, okay,
Gonna be bad.
I was like, I don't know, I'll watch it, but I don't know. And it was good to hear that Leigh Bardugo would be participating. That always makes you feel like, okay, maybe it's not, going to be awful. And they did a great job. And the fact that they had to change so much just to accomplish that, and fans were like, yeah, this is great. You did a good job. No one that I saw was mad that like, this isn't exactly like the book.
And I mean, I think it's a good example, and this is definitely something important, of the people who adapted that understood the characters. They knew who everyone was. And because they understood and knew the characters, they could write something that was convincing, even though, like you said, I forgot, like it's a prequel, right, to Six of Crows books. Like didn't even exist, but everyone was who they were. And I don't know how you get that. I don't know, as a writer, how you
have the author participate in the
well,
adaptation.
I'm sure that is really helpful. But I mean, Peter Jackson,
Yeah.
J.R. Tolkien was dead. Like, so I don't think, I mean, Frank Herbert.
Well, yeah, I mean, in the case of, yeah, he's dead. But
Okay.
his son
his
wrote
son
a bunch
took
of
over.
later
Okay, I
books,
knew
yeah.
that. I was just like, oh no.
It's a very similar situation to Tolkien, with the son carrying on with
except
the
that he wrote, except I think people like how Tolkien's son handled it better than.
Because I don't think, as far as I know, Tolkien's son didn't like write his own novels. He's just kind of like put together and filled in the gaps to like make cohesive like books out of what was previously just more notes. But the showrunner for Shadow and Bone was a huge fan of the books. And so if you can't have the author, to have someone like Peter Jackson, Denis Villeneuve, the showrunner for Shadow and Bone, who are fans of the material. And this can be a hindrance if, again, we're going down the path of this is a carbon copy of the book, whether or not that works on screen. But for the most part, someone who loves the material will, come at it with the same creativity and enthusiasm as the author would.
Yeah, and it's hard because I talked about this a little bit in a Wheel of Time video I made. There is this push now where they claim everyone's a fan. They're like, Rafe Judkins is a super fan. Sorry, I'm very skeptical about that. Everyone's a super fan, blah, 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 blah. So it's kind of hard to see through it, but you can always tell, I feel like, in the end, which is why I don't believe Rafe Judkins is actually that big of a Wheel of Time.
So I believe the Shadow and Bone showrunner is a fan because, like, when they first announced that a deal had been signed that they would be making a show, the showrunner was at a book signing with Leigh Bardugo at Barnes and Noble, and they were just talking about how they'd been talking about these books and how he got an early copy of one of them and read it in the limousine on the way to an event and then demanded the next one from her. And they were talking like friends who had known each other for a long time about the books. And I was like, I think he's a fan. Like, I don't think he could fake this.
Well, it's like, oh, that famous actor whose name I don't remember. He's the Witcher. What's
Henry Cavill?
Henry Cavill, like, he's actually a fan. Like, when you hear him talk, like, you're like,
he's a nerd.
He's a nerd. He likes all the things, and you're like, I believe you, and that's why people love him. I think you definitely can get the sense when it's true and when it's not true, but everyone just likes to claim it now.
Which is also the same thing in an adaptation. You can tell if it was made by people who were sincere in wanting to make this. There's I feel a lot of that's when what I was saying about I give a lot of grace to creativity. I also give a lot of grace to enthusiasm. I would rather have something that's lovingly made, even though the budget wasn't there, so some of it doesn't look that good, and but they had their heart in it. And I mean, Princess Bride, as a film, doesn't really look that good. It's unlike Lord of the Rings. It has
the budget was
super
tiny.
Well. Yeah, and so when everyone loves it, and no one's sitting there going, these rocks look fake, and this is a terrible movie, because it was made with a lot of love and enthusiasm, and has great characters and great personality. And so I would much rather have that than something that looks gorgeous, Rings of Power, and has no heart, no soul, no care and attention to the story. And
it's funny you mentioned Rings of Power, because one of my old videos I did a plot of success versus budget, and that movie is the most outlier ever of 0 budget but 90% score ever. Yeah, so I was going to say this. It's interesting what people are talking about the Rings of Power, and you may disagree with this, Liene. As much as I think Rings of Power is failing, I do get the sense that they were trying. I think they were trying. I think they believe that they were trying. It's just it failed. Like there is a level there where I think like they really wanted it to be like the Lord of the Rings. They wanted it, but they
in
just
surface
weren't
level ways.
well, but they weren't skilled enough. Like, that's my point. There's a difference between someone who sits up here and is like, I'm changing it because I'm better than you, versus I feel like they wanted it, but they just don't have the skill or the story knowledge to carry it. Because of the way they're presenting people, I do feel like they wanted it, but they have zero understanding of how to actually write a good character. I don't know. Everything I've heard from them, it doesn't feel like they're like, we're better than J.R.R. Tolkien. But some people think that because they made it anyway. I don't know. It's hard to say.
I mean,
People are
it's
saying how they
also,
got
as
hired.
much as people like to, sometimes it's true. In the case of Game of Thrones, there was very clearly two people in the last few seasons that ruined this, and everyone else was just fine. But for the most part, it takes a village. So like, yes, the showrunners will take the brunt of it. The script writers will take the brunt of it. But, it takes a lot of people approving something and that will override what a writer originally wanted to put on screen and say, no, market, studies show we need to have this in there instead. And the writer is like, I mean, if you like read the opener for the foreword for Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman, which was originally written for television, the foreword is him saying, on set every day when they were filming it, and they kept taking stuff out that he'd written, and he just kept saying, it's okay, I'll put it back in the book. It's okay, I'll put it back in the book. It's okay, I'll put it back in the book. So like, there's a lot of people who are making those decisions, and oftentimes it can be too many cooks in the kitchen, where like there's
I
something
think
to be
that's a
said for the
huge problem.
creative vision of like a single individual. And Peter Jackson very much feels like it was his vision for Lord of the Rings. And obviously it took a ton of people to like execute on that. But it was his creative idea that like was the ultimate kind of guiding force of the whole project.
Well, also, I mean, I'm sure you have, I've read way too much behind the scenes about Lord of the Rings, just like full disclosure. I am sure you have as well. But it is interesting when you have someone like that at the helm that is so
Did you know that Viggo Mortensen actually broke his foot?
Oh my goodness. No, I've never heard that before. I think what you get the sense that because he had such a strong vision, it inspired everyone else. When people talk about that, they're also inspired. And it is interesting when you see some of the less successful shows, at least for me, people feel less inspired. Like when you hear them talking, there's less of that. And I don't know, it's interesting. I know a lot of people disagreed by what I said about Rings of Power. It's fine. I get it. I think it's bad too, people. Okay. I'm just trying to give them like a little bit here.
Benefit of the doubt.
I do think you're right though about the market research. I do sometimes think that gets in the way. And I said this literally like 8 months before Rings of Power came out. I said, the budget scared me. I said, they're going so hard on saying how much budget they have. We have 450 million. And I thought, that's a bad sign. That's a bad sign because them going so hard, so excited about how much budget they have means they think budget makes a good movie.
Well, there's also
And
something
unless you're spending all of that on writers.
There's something to be said for the creativity that is forced on you when you have limited resources. And often the best thing, I mean, like just speaking personally, like some of my best recipes I came up with when I had not gone to the grocery store and I didn't have a lot to work with and I couldn't go and get any ingredient I wanted to. I was like, okay, what do I have? What can I make with that? And I make something up and like it becomes a stable recipe because like, wow, this was actually kind of brilliant. And I would never have put this together if I hadn't been down to these 2 ingredients, but I was, and this actually worked really well. So like the way that being limited in your resources kind of forces you and constrains you and makes you think outside the box, like what can I do with what I have, instead of we have all of the time, we have 5 seasons and all of the money on the entire planet to just waffle away and do whatever we want, instead of like, okay, we have limited time, limited money, what can we do with that to really make this work? And
in fairness, like at least Rings of Power does look good
expensive.
In terms of
it looks expensive.
It looks expensive. I mean, except for some of the armor. Like ever since you pointed out the armor to me, it has been the bane of my existence, Liene. Like if you just hadn't pointed it out, there's this meme that it looks like paper plates. And like I've never gotten over it. Like it's all I see.
But it's that kind of thing too, where that's why I keep saying it's surface level, because like a lot of it is like it's form over function, where they're like, oh, this would look kind of cool. And you're like, okay, but what makes something feel really cohesive is when you thought about would it function? Would these characters really wear this? Would these characters use this? Does it make sense for them to do this? Because ideally you come up with both. You're like, okay, what would these characters need to have? What would it make sense for them to do? Now, if this is what it makes sense for them to do, how do we make this the prettiest version of that? Instead of, we want it to look like this. Doesn't matter if it makes sense that they would wear this or use this.
Yeah, it's interesting. This isn't an adaptation, but I watched a behind the scenes with the costume designer of Stranger Things, and hearing how she talked about how she costumed them, like how their personality traits and what colors and are they in fashion, like
there's always so much more thought to it than you think.
Detail. Yeah, and sometimes it's like, then I started noticing shows where maybe they don't do that. And I do think Rings of Power is something where they spent way more on the landscape than on what the characters were wearing, because they're like, for me, it was Bronwyn that showed out to me, because I have complained about
maxi
that
dress.
Because I owned that blue maxi dress in 2010 and like, it's so distracting. And so it's interesting. Again, it's like throwing money at something. If you don't have the people who are so inspired, and, you know, it just doesn't mean much. Also, I do have to say, Alex said something up here. So I haven't seen episode 7 yet. Can someone spoil it for me? Is the Galadriel part a dream? Like, is she having a vision when she just stands there and the volcano is exploding on her? Okay. Well, I thought that's what it was. So I feel very sad now.
If only.
So yeah, that's sad.
But I'm told that, you know, it's fantasy, so science need not apply, and the rules are whatever they say they are for a magic volcano. So
so
FYI.
true. I definitely feel that way about fantasy. Doesn't need to make any sense. I've said that so many times. Just do whatever. That's why I love Darling Girl so much.
Oh yeah. They should adapt that on Lifetime.
That's a deep cut for anyone here.
But I mean, the same thing behind the scenes. You look at Lord of the Rings stuff, and the stuff that, like, the same as you're talking about Stranger Things, stuff that you don't even clock. You don't know that they're doing it, but like subconsciously, it all comes together to form a whole. That's why you look at it and you go, I don't know why, but this feels real. And then you look at something else, you're like, this, I don't know why, it doesn't feel real. Because in Lord of the Rings, every single like scabbard and every single like cuff of every single extra that's in the army was like handmade and hand worn, so that it looked like it had been used by this person for their whole life, so that when you have this wide shot of just a crowd of people, that you do not see any of those details, but you do. But
you feel
like, it comes, like, the whole looks right. You're like, this looks right. These people look like they live here.
Yeah, and I think in the Lord of the Rings too, they had a lot of like real weight props and swords and stuff like that, and all that stuff just it contributes.
What do you think? In your opinion, are there broader cultural trends that make poor writing adaptations more likely?
I don't know if it's cultural trends as much as just what kind of show is trending currently, like we talked about at the beginning, where, okay, Game of Thrones is successful and Game of Thrones has violence and sex. So, ergo, fantasy must have violence and sex to be successful, and they don't actually look at why everything works.
It's not because George R. R. Martin's a good writer. It's because there was violence and sex.
Right. And that's my biggest fear about someone like taking Abercrombie's work, being like, look, there's violence and sex in it. Let's adapt it. And it's like, no. You stop it right now.
Luckily, he is alive, so hopefully he'd be involved and be around.
I trust Joe. But I think if someone could read a book like that and think that. And so I think it's a lot more about TV trends. And so they see something like, hey, Shadow and Bone is successful and Game of Thrones is successful. Well, we're going to do Wheel of Time. And there's zero understanding of why this property is there. So I don't know I guess, is that cultural? I don't know if that's cultural. I think it's more just time dependent on what's going on currently. What do you think?
Or there's also, again, like either a trend in TV, like you say, like, oh, Game of Thrones is popular, we have to have our own version of that, instead of let's stand out with our own thing that looks distinct and different from that, because like that I think would make more sense because you have a unique product to offer instead of a shadow of something else. But regardless, I think there's also if there's a story that just feels relevant for the current time, you know, that you find it, like, you know, like Handmaid's Tale felt very relevant for the time, so you pick it up and you adapt it because like now's the time for it. So there's some of that, and there can be like a rush if there is a story that feels particularly relevant to just like, oh, we have to adapt that because like the current time it's relevant for that, with not any attention to like, you know, how to actually do it properly. Is this actually the right time? Are you forcing a message on it because you think it already fits the current time, so you're just going to make it do more of that instead of tell the story that it's actually telling, you know, stuff like that.
Yeah, and I definitely think there is a trend nowadays to, I don't know if I've talked to you about this over DM, where like
Probably.
there's a fear of being misunderstood. So
Yes. We
sometimes
definitely
we did talk
talked
about
about
this.
that.
Okay, we did talk about this. There's this fear of being misunderstood in a way that sometimes when they're adapting something, they're trying to inject the point into it. And you're like, look, can you trust your audience a little bit? Like, I think we'll get it. Or if we don't get it, that's also okay. Like there are levels to a story. And when you try to be so obvious or tell, then your story becomes one note. And I think that's also issues we're seeing, like, for example, in Rings of Power, where a story that they're trying to give depth ends up reading like there's not a lot going on.
Yeah.
I don't mean to keep, picking on Rings of Power. I think a lot do this.
Carry on.
I think a lot do this, but it's just like the most recent example.
Well, and I mean, I know you'll just have to take my word for it because you're not watching House of the Dragon. That both shows, they're well, I think I've certainly talked about this before about how like if you have comedy and drama side by side, they both feel more heightened by that juxtaposition. Mm-hmm. If you have black next to white, they heighten each other. So like having these shows on at the same time is House of the Dragon is a great show, and it just looks miles and away better because it's next to Rings of Power, and Rings of Power is not great. And it looks miles and away worse because it's next to House of the Dragon. So like, they already like it's not that's why one looks good and looks bad, but it's making it more extreme.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of House of the Dragon, which I haven't watched or read, so whatever, but I've seen a lot of people posting about it. And one thing, I guess they posted a quote that there's this actor and George R.R. Martin said he's doing a better job of portraying the character than he even wrote. Have you seen this?
That rings a bell, but
I don't
so many characters in House of the Dragon.
He's like, I don't know. I could go look for the meme, but I thought it was interesting that supposedly George R.R. Martin messaged him being like, you are bringing this character to life more than I did. And I think
if I had to guess, I would say it was probably Viserys that he said that about, but it could be a lot of them.
I think it was actually. That name sounds familiar. And I think Gaiman said that about Stardust. Is that right?
Yeah, I think he liked the movie better than the book, and I like the movie better than the book.
I haven't read or seen it yet. That's my next probably Gaiman, but I'm pretty sure he said he liked the movie better than the book. And I always think that's so interesting. I love sometimes when authors are so open about being like, yeah, like there was something that you did that increased my vision. And I think some fans always want to act like an adaptation can never, ever, ever be the original thing. So I always like when actual authors even weigh in on their own work.
Well, this has also happened kind of. This isn't important. That's not what we're talking about. But with real life, Tom Hardy, my favorite, he played the real life person, Bronson, who's like one of the longest serving, or not serving, but he's been incarcerated the longest, and he's never actually killed anybody. But he's like known as like the most violent prisoner, but he's never actually killed anyone. And the guy, like the real guy, like really buffed up because he had nothing else to do in solitary confinement. So he's just like constantly just like working out because he doesn't have anything else to do. So for the role, Tom Hardy buffed up a ton to play that role. And there was like a story about Tom going to visit him when he first got the role, when he was just Tom himself, as he is, went to go see him. And Bronson was like, you can't play me. And then 6 weeks later, he shows up fully bulked out. And Bronson was like, you have more muscle than me. You got muscle in places muscle shouldn't be. It's like, okay, you outdid me.
You can do it.
So it's almost like an author saying you did better than my character. It's like, hey, you can play me better than I can.
I can play me. Yeah, so I think it's just interesting. And
The Prestige film.
I absolutely love The Prestige. Have not read the book though. And I think you were the one who's like, no, there's no point. Don't read it.
I think, when you read the book, because you have to give credit where it's due, because like Christopher Nolan didn't come up with a lot of the ideas that are in there. He just took what was there and made it better. So like it's not like, the book deserves credit basically for like putting this idea there. And then Nolan was like, okay, but you know what? We can make this better.
We can improve it. Yeah, I think such. And then you have, speaking of that, what we just talked about, you also have people like Leigh Bardugo who took the opportunity to make some changes. And that people, I think, responded very positively to. I think that was mostly in The Shadow and Bone, but I heard there was a lot of things about like consent and things that she felt like weren't clear and wanted to improve in the adaptation. So I think that's really interesting. And diversity, yeah. So,
well, and this also, so maybe it's time to talk about that. But like the fact that she the fact that they, they added more diversity to the characters than is actually present in the original text, but they didn't just say, hey, let's just cast people of color and like then mission and just done. They rewrote the story where it needed to be rewritten to make it make sense that these were now characters of color. They didn't just stick it in there without explaining it or thinking it through or putting effort into like making the story make sense still and making space for that to be a reality in your world, because you can do that, but people do it lazily. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and we've talked a lot about that, where we said, like they made that make sense, and House of the Dragon did it. Kyle was like, yeah, they just ignored the stuff in the book that would make it not make sense, and so now it makes sense. And then we talked about Rings of Power, where like I actually quite like all the characters that they put, but you also made the good comment of like, but where are the rest of the people? Like, why is everyone else white? Like, why aren't there other black dwarves and black elves to like fill out your world? It wouldn't take much to make it make sense. Yeah, we need to talk about other things besides Rings of Power. There's got to be something else out there, other bad adaptations we can talk about.
Oh, bad adaptations, probably. Almost certainly.
Or good. We talked about Good Omens. I see your book back there. Good Omens is a great adaptation. Did also change some genders.
And Amazon did it, which is why that was like one of the first they did. And so then when it was announced after that they were doing Wheel of Time and Rings of Power, I was like, well, they did a good job with Good Omens. So
Neil Gaiman was decently involved in Good Omens.
Was heavily involved.
He was heavily involved. So that's the big difference, right? We got two dead authors with Wheel of Time and Lord of the Rings.
Which again, House of the Dragon does have George R.R. Martin around to help him out.
Yeah. And is that doesn't necessarily mean anything. Think of I know a great one that's terrible. I always say it wrong.
Is it Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them?
That's not an adaptation. And I never want to talk about that movie because in my world, it doesn't exist. And we've talked about this, Liana.
I'm sorry.
Aragon.
Mm-hmm.
The author was very much alive for that. And it was very much
I haven't read it, but also isn't that book just like not that good either?
So the context of this is like, I read that book for the first time when I was 12 or 13 or something. That's when it came out.
Well, the guy wrote it at like 16, didn't he?
He was 15 when he wrote it. I was a little older, maybe 14 or 15 when I read it. And then the movie came out when I was 16. Now, I have reread the book since then. And I was like, oh, well,
a 16-year-old wrote this.
But yeah, I mean, and I tell everyone, I'm like, I'm impressed that he wrote it. I think it's actually very impressive for a 15-year-old to write it. It's just when you're an adult, you're like, wow, this was so much more derivative than I realized.
Well, this is how I convinced you to reconsider finishing Red Rising when you learned that Pierce Brown was like 23 when he wrote Red Rising.
Everything made sense. And I was like, okay. And so I still think it's a great series for like readers getting into fantasy because it'll make them feel like they're reading something really long, but it's still like very accessible. But yes, as an adult, it's pretty derivative. But that being said, the movie was just a travesty. And he was alive, but he was also very young. And so I bet he didn't have the maybe confidence or even the power. Like Neil Gaiman, for example, the power level there is going to be very different, right? Neil Gaiman is, by the time they're making Good Omens, I mean, he's...
does it depend? It depends on what they negotiate in the contract when they sign the rights, and an author that has more contractual power and leverage to put that in the contract. I mean, like I learned quite recently that I never really thought about it before, but like in the Universal parks, everywhere in the park, they sell Dasani water and Doritos and whatever. The only part of the park where they don't is the Harry Potter part of the park. And I just took it for granted. I was like, oh, this is, they have Harry Potter version of water here. But like, I didn't really think about how it's the only part of the park that has like an in-universe water. Yeah. And I learned it was because J.K. Rowling required that of any park that would get the rights to do Harry Potter, that
and
there
everyone's
would be no name brands anywhere.
Everyone's going to listen to her. She's got, you want that. And I think that's like one of the reasons why I'm not super concerned about like a Sanderson adaptation, which obviously means more to me necessarily than you. But
I would like it to be good. I want to enjoy good fantasy TV.
Because right now he has a lot of leverage, and he has said over and over again that he's like, I just say no, I don't need money. So that kind of leverage where like you don't need anybody. J.K. Rowling, she doesn't need Universal to make a theme park. She doesn't need it, so she can demand something. The Aragon kid, Christopher Paolini, he probably was like, someone wants to make a movie, let me sign on the dotted line. So like it is different. Someone mentioned Ender's Game. It's another good example of a bad adaptation. Have you read Ender's Game?
I have not seen it or read it. All I know is that Alex Nieves hates both.
Oh. I like Ender's Game. I liked it quite a bit when I read it. Yeah, that's exactly right. It's not bad. It's just derivative. Ender's Game is a great example of a movie that didn't understand the point of the book. Like that's a great like, oh, let's fight. Let's have all this stuff. And it was like, well, that you read the book and did not like, whew, like
did not understand the assignment.
You did not understand the assignment. And I do think that can also maybe come from a lack of understanding that fantasy can mean something bigger than it is. Like a lot of people are like, it's just dragons and fighting. And like the Lord of the Rings did a great job of really getting the themes of like hope and darkness and light in there. Something that I think was attempted in Rings of Power, but is missing. Again, attempted in Wheel of Time is missing. The understanding of the core values are there. Actually, great. Sorry, this is another Ring of Power example. I'm so sorry.
Oh, be my guest.
You haven't read the Silmarillion?
So I started reading it before Rings of Power because I was like, I should read the Silmarillion before Rings of Power. And then like I hadn't finished it before the show started running. And then I started watching the show and I was like, you know what? I should not read the Silmarillion because it will just make me mad. So I'm just going to not finish this right now.
But so they have like this elf-human relationship in the show. And I was kind of excited about it because there's a very famous elf.
Theron Luthien.
Yeah. And in the Silmarillion, there's just so much subtext about what that means. It's about these races and where they started and what they mean to each other. There's just a lot of layers to that story. It was one of my favorites.
Even in Lord of the Rings, you have a sense of that between Aragorn and Arwen.
Yes. And here, it's just not there. Like you get, like they talk about it. Like at the very second episode, they're like, that always ends in death, which I thought was very funny. And I was like, oh, this is going to be good. And then it just like, well, that was it. They're going to mention it because like we checked that box. We mentioned it's tough. And then it's like, nothing's there. And it's interesting you mentioned Arwen and Aragorn because I talk a lot about Rings of Power. None of the characters feel like they have a history. Not everyone feels like they kind of showed up on screen and that's the first time they existed. I mean, Kyle, you pretty much summed up the last 40 minutes. I'm not going to lie.
All right, that's a wrap. Good night, everybody.
But when Arwen and Aragorn first meet on screen, you just feel so much history because they don't say anything. It's all unspoken, right? It's all about blocking and how they wrote it. And
sometimes less is more.
Yeah, they didn't have to say it. They didn't really say it right there. You just already knew.
Well, this is one of the things that I keep praising. And again, this is when I was like, having these shows on the same time is doing one of them no favors because House of the Dragon, even more so than a lot of shows, and certainly more than Rings of Power, it trusts its audience to piece things together. And it's partially because there is, unlike Rings of Power, there is so much story to get through that they have to cram it all into every episode as much as they possibly can. And so in the interest of like expediency, then instead of taking the time to tell you a thing, they literally do not have the time to tell you the thing. So they're going to show you enough like contextual information for you to fill that in yourself because look, you're going to get it. We hope anyway. So moving on, we don't have time to explain this to you. And so when you're watching it, I feel like it engages you more because then you sit there going, oh, I wonder what this is. And now I'm looking for the answer for it. And now there's the answer instead of you just telling me everything all the time. And I'm just like, what is this lecture? Like, there's no like, I'm curious now. I want to learn what this is. I'm going to pay attention to see if I can figure out what this thing is.
Yeah, it's the classic tell no and not showing, and it takes a lot of skill to write scenes like that. And I mean, yeah, it comes down a lot to skill. And maybe I do think too many cooks in the kitchen. I think some of these big budget projects, because they're throwing so much money out of it, everyone gets a say. And when everyone gets a say, a vision isn't going to be there.
Yeah. Well, there is also a lot. You have to have good actors to pull this off is also the thing. Like no matter what script you write, if you're relying on a scene to be silently conveying something to your audience, you have to have good actors to do that. And yeah, House of the Dragon has Matt Smith's obviously one of them, but pretty much everyone in House of the Dragon is fantastically cast. So like they can just trust them to be like we don't have time to tell this story, so just show it on your face for us, please.
Yeah, and it's interesting because even a good actor though can't overcome everything. Can't overcome everything, but it can overcome a lot.
It can sometimes. That's sometimes what, like, well, in the case of a series, what George R. R. Martin said can, in fact, have the author saying, "Hey, what you brought to the table as the actor, you did me one better than I actually did in the source material."
And it's interesting. You can usually tell who those actors are because even in a bad adaptation, you may connect to a character, and you're like, it's because you were trying the hardest you could with your. And I don't know, because the only character right now that I feel like I feel anything for. And I know he's a famous guy and I should know his name.
In Rings of Power?
Islander's dad. What's Islander's dad's name again?
Oh, Elendil?
He's the only person at this point that I like feels like a real person to me.
Him and Halbrand. And Halbrand is mainly because like he's kind of like Matt Smith's character in House of the Dragon, where he just shows up and does stuff that's kind of like, I don't know what your deal is, and that makes me curious, as opposed to everyone else who's like, here is my motivation, and let me explain to you why. Like, because there's somebody who's like a kind of a mystery, and the guy who's playing it, he's got some charisma, more charisma than most of the other actors in the show. So even though there's a lot of,
I mean, I don't care about him, but I literally think I only care about Islander's dad. I'm just like, he's the only one. I'm just like, you're trying and you're actually bringing something to this role that feels correct.
I would say I would have agreed with you, but this latest episode made me very, very much hate that character. So
yeah, I haven't watched episode 7. I heard it was really terrible. So
I will say, like, when we first met Ellen, well, not on the ship, but when they were in Numenor and Elendil was like actually like participating in the story. It was the horse riding episode, and that was really dumb. But he, for the first time, felt like a character from Lord of the Rings who knew the lore.
He felt like a character. Actually, what I said earlier, he felt like a character who actually had history. He felt like a character who existed before he showed up on screen.
Yeah.
Where every other character, I was like, you were birthed the minute you got on screen, and you have no history. And again, that's also writers feel like they have to tell you everything they know about a character, which is also bad. That happens in books a lot. You're like, no, you should know a lot that readers don't know, but it informs the character.
Same with world building too. Like, let me explain to you why this is here and all of the history behind it, even though in this conversation it makes no sense for these characters to be explaining their own history to each other. And you're like, why? But adaptations versus reimaginations. Would you consider Wheel of Time a reimagination of Lord of the Rings an adaptation?
Wow. Let me tell you. I think the Wheel of Time would have been better if it claimed to be a reimagination. What I think Wheel of Time.
I mean, Rings of Power basically came out and said we are a reimagining. The story Tolkien never told.
You know what? Though? I respect it. I seriously respect them for being like, this isn't an adaptation. Like, I at least respect the honesty.
Well, that's because they were contractually obligated to not make that.
Good.
They had to say because it's not
obligated to say that. Good. Because with Wheel of Time, I always say this. I'm like, what they should have done, they wanted to just focus on the Aes Sedai. Great. They should have just named the show The Tower and been like, we're just doing a show about the Aes Sedai because that's the thing we're interested in. And you know what? I feel like it would have gone over better because then people wouldn't have expected it to be an adaptation. I don't think it is a reimagining. I think it's trying to be an adaptation and failing. It was just, it was bad, not just from the books bad. It was bad because it was a bad show. Episode 8, it's all the classic signs of bad writing. Did you make it to episode 8?
Yeah, I watched the whole thing.
Okay. It was bad, right? This isn't just because I like the books. Okay,
no, it was awful.
Just checking.
I think you gave the whole show a lot more grace because you liked the books and you were like hoping that, like, benefit of the doubt, it'll get there.
I have said this many times. I am an eternal optimist. And so with Rings of Power, I have been like, it's fine. It's going to get better. It's going to get better. And finally, it's like I gave it 6 episodes and I am broken now. So that's what happens. Like the switch gets flipped where I'm like being so nice. And then I'm like, that's it. This sucks. I
think Kyle's trying to convince you to watch House of the Dragon with this.
Yeah, I'm assaulted daily between you and Kyle and sometimes Jimmy about Game of Thrones. So now House of the Dragon. He's like keeping track of this one doesn't have as many sex scenes, so you can watch it.
I mean, they're there. I'm not gonna lie to you, but yeah. Way back now in our conversation, when we were talking about Too Many Cooks in the Kitchen, and I actually kind of wanted to talk about, this isn't an adaptation, but nevertheless is like, it's in the extended family of what we're talking about, Star Wars. I watched like probably cumulatively weeks of content if you add up all the hours of content that I watched on taking down Rise of Skywalker and why it makes no sense, and then how it could have been rewritten and how this came to be, and just
Star Wars
so
conversation just like awakened something to me. I just really feel like we shouldn't go there, but continue.
Well, I was just saying, after all of that, it was like quite some time later, after absorbing all of that, it was like years later that I saw some a video that was kind of unpacking how we arrived at the plot that we had, and how the basically like a lot of the things that don't make sense about it, that like truly do not make sense, where you're like you can't understand how we went from point A to point B, like how someone thought you could connect those things, like that this would be a logical progression. And when you look at like when they finally were able to look at old scripts and old ideas and old like iterations of the story, all of the extra footage that got cut, and how there's like the vestigial structures of plots that made sense, but all of what was around that plot point is now gone, and we're left with this one plot point that by itself is not connected to anything else and doesn't make any sense. And then this is when like the too many cooks in the kitchen, where you're like, okay, this story, it's not that one person sat down and wrote complete nonsense from start to finish. It's that there was a plot that had like things connected to it and progressions and things building and things, like it wasn't the nonsense that it is now. But when you're like, let me just cherry pick some of the plot points that you had in this massive story and not any of the connecting tissue, you end up with something that is nonsense. And like that's to a greater or lesser degree, which can happen with adaptations, when someone is like, here's how we need to adapt this. And then 50 executives are like, take that out, put this in, take that out, put this in. And then you're like, but now this makes no sense. What is this?
Yeah, that whole thing was a mess, right? And then you also had like fighting directors where like, they were like, well, I don't like what you did in the first one, so I'm going to change it. And then the same director came back for the third one, was like, well, I don't like what you changed, so I'm going to change it back. And you're just like, this is too.
It's basically the fairies from Sleeping Beauty fighting over the dress that Sleeping Beauty is wearing.
Oh my gosh, yes. That is the sequel trilogies. Oh my gosh. And it's, and Obi-Wan, the Obi-Wan show. Sorry, this is kind of random. I just think because we're on Star Wars. Like that also was a show where I was like, did you watch this? Did anyone before producing this watch this show? Like, I know we've harped it to death, like the horse riding scene, but that scene where that little girl is running from people, like, did you watch this? And my friend Nick from Wicked Good Books, who's a film person, was also talking about how like they could have just like edited that to make it make more sense. Like you could have taken some scenes out and edited it, and like just no one, not a single person from A to B, and you just think, are these yes men? Like what's happening? I don't understand it. I think, okay, do you think the rush to get new content out has anything to do with it? Like being like, we have to do it now, and get a new product out. Is that affecting this?
I think I wouldn't say like you can't put the entire blame on that, but it's certainly one of the many factors. There's executives who want to make sure this is bankable. There's people who don't understand the material they're developing. There's constraints of time, meaning we have to like pump this out immediately. There's stories there's stories like Obi-Wan where they've decided that the new way to go is to do TV shows. And for a lot of stories, it's like, thank God, because like back in the day, it had to be a movie, and you could never tell Game of Thrones in a movie. You'd need 10 movies. Like that's nuts. Mm-hmm. So like having TV as an option is great. But for other stories, it's the opposite. Like this should not be a TV show. And so like Obi-Wan, you're like, nope, this is Disney says we're doing content that's streaming now. And you're like, but Obi-Wan isn't a series. Like that's a movie. At best, maybe a 3-episode miniseries. And it's that like where somebody who's the director and writer for Obi-Wan would not have gotten to say, no, I think this should be a movie. Like they don't get to say that. So
yeah, and that's actually another good point about how I feel like we're also going overboard on the length of things. Like, why is every Rings of Power episode an hour and 15 minutes? There's absolutely no reason. And an example of a show that I actually love. So Stranger Things season 4. There was 2 episodes at the end, and each of them were like 2 hours, I think. They were super long. And the first of those did not need 2 hours. As much as I love that show, I was like, dude, there were so many things you could have cut out. Now, the second episode did. Like every moment of that 2 hours was needed. And I'm just like, why are we just like, we need an hour and 15-minute show. It's going to make it better. Like there's so much you could cut out and make it why are we losing the 45-minute show? You
It
can
was the
do it.
same like when I heard people saying that, oh, Rings of Power, it's slow because it's going to be 5 seasons. And I'm like, no, if you're telling me you need 5 seasons, it's because you have so much story that it requires 5 seasons to tell it, not, oh, it's like procrastinating with your homework. I've got 5 weeks to hand in this assignment, so I'll do a little bit today, but not all of it. Like, no, it should be 5 weeks of work. Like, every episode should have a reason to be there, not be like,
Have a
well, we
reason.
didn't have to move the plot forward in this one because we've got 10 more to go. Like, that's no, that's not how this works. And I feel
Yeah,
like
and it's interesting because these seem to be they just keep getting greenlit, and so it's also like maybe everybody has just lowered their expectations. Like people just want to watch TV, and there's so much content, so they watch it, and it's fine. And if it's not actively bad, then they just keep watching it.
this reminds me of David Mitchell's rant from back in the day when Downton Abbey was the big thing, and then the second season of Downton Abbey came out, and he's a British comedian who likes to be quite negative and snarky. And he was ranting about how Downton Abbey season 2 completely went off the rails. But what he's really upset about is that no one noticed. In fact, its ratings were higher than the first season. And he's like, so really the first season is the shameful one, because why bother making something quality when people will just watch anything? It doesn't, as long as Dame Maggie Smith's in it with a cool hat and it's got some British accents in it, it doesn't matter. It doesn't make any sense. So like there is that. They're like, well, if we make it, people will watch it.
Yeah, and it's just about, what's actually going to last. And you think of things, so Lord of the Rings, that's definitely lasting power. The original Star Wars, they're just never going anywhere. I'm sure Game of Thrones is going to be watched for years and years and years. It was just too
The
much.
first 4 seasons.
It was too, I mean, Game of Thrones, like one interesting thing about Game of Thrones that is different from other ones is it's less family friendly. So people have to wait to show it to people later, and people didn't like the ending. So it's going to be interesting to see how that affects it going forward.
Which there is a lot
in
of
the long
people have
run.
suggested this, and usually I've heard it from people who are using it as a reason to justify Rings of Power being the way that it is, which is a weird. It's weird to me that they're doing this, but they're basically saying that like, well, you can't compare them because HBO messed up the end of Game of Thrones, so they had something to prove. They had to make sure House of the Dragon was good because they knew that people were mad about how Game of Thrones ended, so they had to like prove that no, this is going to be better than that. And I was like, I mean, I do think that that's true. I do think that they felt pressure to be like, no, guys, like, we got rid of those dunderheads who messed it up. We got rid of them. We've got the good team back. We can make this good. There is some of that. But at the same time, the idea that, like, so every other show gets a pass and is off the hook. It's only House of the Dragon that, like, had to, like, like do extra credit work, to not fail out of class. It's like, well, Rings of Power should equally need to prove itself to us to, like, earn its audience. It's not like, well, we didn't mess anything up before, so we don't have to try. Like, that's what?
That's just not how you make something that lasts, or art, right? It's a lot of these shows are just going to go into oblivion. One interesting, again, not an I mean, it is an adaptation, but different format. It's like Marvel. I'm really curious. I mean, now it's never going to end. So maybe in 30 years, we'll still be having new movies come out for all I know. But it'll be interesting to see like which one of those stick around, because it does feel like some of them are like these classics that people are going to want to watch over and over again. But as more and more content comes out, and most people agree it gets oversaturation and less interesting, less and less creative, less and less new, are those going to also just go to obscurity? It's going to be interesting to see. Of course, we can't predict it, right? We got to wait the 30 or 40 years.
Well, in the same vein of like, there's copycats that are like, well, like we said, Game of Thrones is successful because there's, R-rated content. So that's what makes it successful. We need to make something R-rated in fantasy. There is another part of the copycatting is that instead of tapping into unadapted, unknown stories and authors, they're just doing, again, like Rings of Power, like, okay, Lord of the Rings, like there's a lot of material there. You could do more in the world of Tolkien. But there are so many stories you could adapt. There are so many authors that have amazing books that would make amazing TV shows. Like, and just think like how much Amazon would stand out from and not be compared to House of the Dragon if they had, for example, adapted the Greenbone saga, because no one else is doing that. No one else's show looks like that. And even if they didn't do a super great job with it, at the very least, people would be like, this is fresh. This is new. This isn't, oh, I've seen this and I've seen it better.
Yeah, and it's always going to be brand and name recognition. And it's working. That's the worst part. Where are these execs going to feel like they need to do something new when, Rings of Power had the biggest premiere or whatever, and is probably being a complete cash cow, even as people dislike it. I mean, that's at some point why I finally drew the line and said I'm not watching Star Wars content. I finally was like, until someone tells me it's good.
Although I
refuse to
just
give them
started
my
watching
go.
Andor, and so far
I know,
really
I heard
like
it's
it.
amazing, and I'm really mad about it
Really like
because
it.
I needed it also to suck so I could prove that I was boycotting something.
But I also said when I was watching it with my brother that like while other Star Wars content, I mean, I didn't watch a lot of it. I would just like watch videos on it. I watched The Mandalorian, but like I watched one episode of Boba Fett and was like, nope. I watched one episode of Obi-Wan and I was like, nope. So like I haven't really watched a lot of it, but it's very kind of simple storytelling of like, here's the villain, we kill him. Here's the villain, we shoot him. Here's the villain, we run away from them. Like it's very simple storytelling. And Star Wars has tended to be that way, but Andor, I was like, this is the Game of Thrones of Star Wars. Like it's a very political story with like a lot of like details that are like not accessible to a child. Like a kid can watch The Mandalorian, and it's not because it's violent, but a kid would be bored out of their mind by Andor because it's a lot of like discussion of like, you know, it's kind of like when it's a better version, but it's kind of when people talk about Phantom Menace and they're talking about trade agreements, and you're like, is it kids are like, what? I don't understand.
Our 7-year-old, and he was like, well, the pod racing was great. And at some point I had to pause and be like, do you understand what's happening here? Can I explain to you? Like we did, we paused the movie and we're like, let's explain to you in simple terms what's happening here. Yeah, I've heard great things. I'm gonna watch Andor, but I am refusing until all 12 episodes is out.
To be fair, like it's not like my new favorite show, but compared to everything else that's been coming out, watching it, I keep waiting for it to suck, and I'm watching it, and I'm just like, this is good. This doesn't suck. I like this, which is a high bar apparently.
I'll watch it if all 12 episodes come out and everyone's like, it was worth watching, then I will watch it. But not until then and not before then.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I don't know. It's something intrinsic. And I do think, like you said, like, wouldn't it be nice if they wanted to take more risk? But I think people who want to take that risk have
Game of Thrones was a risk, which is what people now forget.
Yes. And they have an artistic vision and they want to do it. Of course, that is going to meet more pushback to getting funded. So yes, man, can you imagine? Greenbone Saga would make a great adaptation. All these things, but they also have to be found to the right people who have the vision and are going to fight for it. So it's tough. And Wheel of Time is interesting because Wheel of Time wasn't like a copy. That's
what my brother said. My brother was like, "Oh, a planet that doesn't have sand. Thank God,
not desert planet." Yeah, I think Wheel of Time was an interesting one because in some ways Wheel of Time could have been a risk because it was a new property technically in terms of like it's not like it had that name recognition. They just did a bad job. It also had a lot of money though. Again, another one that was like, wow, they really just like went for it with all that budget. I don't know.
But not in the right places. Because I mean, like we talked about this too, because not as contemporaneous as Rings of Power and House of the Dragon, but like Wheel of Time and Shadow and Bone were a little more contemporaneous. And there again, where we were watching a much better version and a much less good version, where Shadow and Bone had a much lower budget, but they used it wisely. And that's the same thing I was talking about before, where like, if you don't have that much, then you have to be careful and clever with how you're going to use it, as opposed to being like, well, we have money, so just throw money at the scene and then it'll look expensive and then it'll be great. And you're like, as opposed to like the sort of like guerrilla filmmaker that's like, we've got $10. Like how cool can we make this look with $10?
Yeah. And well, the interesting I was going to say about Wheel of Time is at least Rings of Power looks good. Wheel of Time had a lot of money, and sometimes I'm like, where did you put that money? At least I know where Rings of Power put their money. Like, you watch that show and you know where the money went. Wheel of Time, like, I'm not saying it looks terrible. There were some good scenes, but it was sometimes confusing. Like, where did $350 million go?
To Rosamund Pike.
I mean, and that's valid, to be honest. I thought she was a great Moraine, one of my favorite parts of the show.
Which, I mean, Wheel of Time, like, she was a name, a recognizable name. Rings of Power doesn't really have anyone in it that's like a Rosamund Pike, where you're like, well, I know her. Yeah, it's all unknown.
Although I do think in the end, Rosamund Pike may be a hindrance to the story, because I guess I've heard they are giving her a much bigger role because they can't have Rosamund Pike and not have her be the main in every episode.
Although one of my problems with Sandman is that they had Stephen Fry and then hardly used him. And I'm like, you have Stephen Fry. Why isn't he in this more? Where is his character?
Right. It's interesting because it's like, I've gone on record being like, Rosamund Pike is the perfect Moraine. Like, she is perfect. Like, as Moraine is my favorite character of the Wheel of Time, I'm here to say like she is perfect.
Oh,
But
she would
if
be
you
perfect in the perfect adaptation.
yes. But if you're telling me that your adaptation suffers because you have her, then maybe I would like a slightly less perfect Moraine and a better adaptation. Yeah. I don't know. That's the
Yeah.
thought. Like if I got a less good Moraine, but the adaptation as a whole was better because they didn't feel forced to put her in every scene that she didn't need to be
I
in.
mean, and that's the same thing though, like I would rather have low budget with heart than high budget with no heart. You know, that's like Princess Bride, you know, like if you made an expensive Princess Bride where no one in it really cared about it that much, no one really like loved it, it wasn't like this passion project, it would be like this empty pretty shell versus something that looks kind of crappy, it looks kind of cheap, but it has the characters and the story and the heart that's why it's still a classic.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I'm thinking of casting now because another thing Stranger Things really nailed was casting. And in the first season had a lot of unknowns. Now, of course, they had Winona Ryder. And like, yes,
But
obviously.
they didn't do with her what they did with Moiraine, where like she has to be in every scene and it has to be the main character. She wasn't.
She wasn't. She wasn't. She was a supporting character and she played the heck out of it. I just rewatched that first season and I was like, wow, man, she was great.
And I mean,
But
this is a similar thing that we've talked about before, in terms of a lot of stories will do this, basically the equivalent of that, but with characters, like known characters, and like make them be central where they don't need to be. You know, Star Wars did this where they were like, this should be the new people's story. Why are Han Solo and Luke and Leia hanging out so much? Like they had their trilogy. Let the new people take it.
that name recognition thing kills so many things. We're like, we need to put
Well,
as
and so
many
I think
people
Rings of Power is hindered by that, not with celebrity name recognition, but with like we have to have Galadriel and Isildur, and like it's like how about not? How about you just told some stories about people that we don't know about because they weren't made by Peter Jackson already?
Well, I do think, at the beginning of this time when the show was first coming out, I actually thought Galadriel was a good choice because really we know very little about her in actual Tolkien lore. So I thought like, oh, that could be a great choice. Now, I thought Galadriel was going to be really the only name we saw. And I wish that was the case because if it was really like a story just about Galadriel and we didn't have Elrond, although I mean, I'll admit Elrond and Durin are the most enjoyable part of the show, but they're so far, I'm only on episode 6, but like they contextually, like they're related to nothing. So like if you just had a show about Galadriel and you maybe had a couple cameos from people that were in her life, but it was just like, that would have been better every time. Like, do we know who the stranger is yet? Like, I just want to say, if the stranger is Gandalf, I will jump off a bridge.
Like I keep
Like
calling him not Gandalf.
I will jump off a bridge. I will no longer exist as a human because I will be so angry at like, look, it's Gandalf. We got him. Yay.
So
It's
surprised.
Like,
did you guys see this coming?
don't just like rely on name recognition to get you through something. I mean, that's what did that was Rise.
And like to this point, someone else described it. I don't remember if it was like a DM or a comment at this point, but someone said that every episode of Rings of Power feels like a really, really extended teaser trailer. Because nothing actually moves the plot forward. It just keeps showing you another thing, and you're like, yes, you teased this. You teased this in every episode. Like you need to pay it off, or what? Like you cannot keep showing me this thing and being like, I wonder what it is. Wonder what it is for like 8 episodes. You're like, you know what? I don't wonder what it is. I don't care what it is.
I think, yeah, and I think again it goes back to like a lack of understanding of what made a thing good. They're like, well, people love Gandalf and people loved Galadriel and people love that. So if we have them in the show, it'll be good. Versus like, no, make some new characters, make some original characters, and let people fall in love with a new character. Because you have good enough writing to make a character feel real and there. I feel like we've been talking about bad ones. Should we talk about what makes something good? Like, do we have examples of what? I guess we've talked about House of the Dragon.
How good Lord of the Rings is, and I mean, when I was talking about
Good Omens, what made Good Omens good? Casting helped Good Omens a lot, I think.
And again, it helps to have, I mean, yes, the author's involved in it, but it helps to, again, have people, because they made changes. It wasn't a carbon copy of the book, but to understand where updates needed to be made because it was written quite some time ago and it's a modern setting, which is not a thing fantasy often has to deal with. So like characters now have cell phones. They did not have cell phones when this was written. So things like that were like, okay, we need to update the story so that it makes sense for a modern audience and things like that. So it's just knowing your source material and knowing your medium and understanding both and what works about them, and so that you have a successful adaptation.
Yeah, and again, that was definitely an adaptation that understand the point of Good Omens. It understood the humor. It understood what it was doing and had the right characters. I mean, for me, that Aziraphale and Crowley are like canon in my head now. They just like killed it in such a way. And that's again someone who knew who was, and those were big names. They were big names, but they, you know, they did the thing somehow.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is it also. It's
Yeah, completely.
and again, it's also, I've said a ton of times that like, and this is true in books and in film and television, that it's almost never how much time you spend with somebody. It's like getting the right key moments. Because like Boromir is my favorite example of that. Is that like I've spent 7 hours now with these rings, more than 7 hours with these Rings of Power characters, and they could literally all die, and I frankly would be relieved. But Boromir, you see honestly quite little of him in Fellowship of the Ring. He doesn't have a lot of lines. He doesn't have a lot of screen time. And by the end of that movie, spoilers, when he dies, that's an impactful moment, and you feel like you are brokenhearted about this character, and you didn't need to see him for 10 hours. Like, it was, you had the right moments, the key moments, the important moments. He had an entire character arc that you saw, even though like he barely said anything in the movie, like comparatively.
Yeah, and again, that's about being intelligent enough for every scene of your film meaning something. It doesn't have to, every scene shows something new about a character, shows something new about a setting or the plot. And every scene that Boromir was in said something about who he was. So even though it's probably like 10 minutes of screen time, I don't know, that'd be actually really interesting to find out how much screen time.
You're the stats person. I rely on you.
I'll go Google it at some point, because it's so true. I use that example. I used the example actually in Stranger Things 4. Did you watch Stranger Things 4?
Yeah.
Okay. Enzo. I think Enzo's the perfect example. I loved him so much, and I Googled it, and he has 20 minutes of screen time in the like 12-hour season. And he was one of my favorite characters because I knew exactly who he was. He had every moment. And when you do compare that to unsuccessful things like Rings of Power, where you're like, the scene I used most recently, it might have been episode 4, where Galadriel fights all the Numenorians. Like, you know what I'm talking about? Like that scene where she like battles them. I don't know.
For training.
For training, yes.
Okay.
Training.
Because she also like fights the guards out of her cell.
Oh, let's not talk about that. I don't want to talk about that. Let's talk about, again, another scene for pretending doesn't exist. So that training scene, I remember turning to Zach and being like, that was nothing new. You are showing me the same aspect of Galadriel's character over and over and over again.
We did learn that Numenor is actually a poor country because they can't afford a training ring for their army. They had
and
to
someone
fight
pointed out they used real swords, which is like what you would never do in training. But anyway, that's all besides the point.
They're training at farmers market instead of.
The point is they keep acting like they're showing Galadriel doing something. You're like, look, was that episode 4? I think that was episode 4. And it was
where
like,
the training happened. I think so, yeah.
Yeah, it might have actually even been 5, which if it was, that's so depressing. But I'm 4 hours in, and the only thing you have shown me about Galadriel is that she can fight. Okay, every scene with Galadriel should show me another aspect of her. And it's like this rule of cool, well, this scene will be fun. And so we know nobody because it's just the same thing over and over and over again.
Not to always compare it to House of the Dragon, but I did recently, because I mean, this has been true, I guess, throughout the show, but I only recently pointed it out in, I think for the episode from last week. So like last week's video on it. Because obviously House of the Dragon, it has dragons in it. I don't know if you're aware. And dragons are a cool thing, that requires a substantial CGI budget to not look stupid. But like, there's a bunch of dragons in the show. And certainly having dragons on screen, I don't think anyone would be very mad about a dragon just being on screen for no reason. Because you're just like, that's very cool. Yeah. But House of the Dragon ain't got time for that. And every time there's a dragon scene, I mean, again, they can't waste a ton of budget on just having dragons constantly around. So when they have a dragon in the scene, yes, it looks cool, but it also feels cool because anytime there's a dragon scene, it is plot and character relevant. It's not just, ooh, a dragon. It's doing something to further the story and to further character development. And the moment of this dragon flying isn't just like a cool visual. It's got so much meat behind it. And so like that's what makes a moment epic. It's not just, oh, look, like the fact that Gandalf shows up with the Rohirrim, you know, at the Battle of Helm's Deep. It's not cool because, oh, there's sunlight and an army. I mean, certainly that looks nice, but it's an epic moment because you felt like you're with this army that you feel a lot for, and they're going to lose. And then you're like, here is our savior, and Gandalf, we love him, and there's the Rohirrim, and like you feel that, and that's what makes that moment cool. And yes, it looks nice, but it looking nice is like the least of it.
Yeah, and I think again, it's you can't buy emotion. You can't buy meaningful moments. You can't fake it. So a lot of what they try to do, and we've talked about this as well, we're going to make the music swell and we're going to make the filming make this feel dramatic, but I'll have no emotion to it because there wasn't, oh my gosh, we have the Smaug origins. Oh, Smaug. I was thinking he said, never mind. I was thinking he said Smeagol.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, if Rings of Power had Smaug, I would, and they got Benedict Cumberbatch back, I'd be like, I don't care. There's no plot. It's just what it
is. You know, The Hobbit. So The Hobbit's a great example of, wow, did they nail the casting? Oh man, when Martin Freeman was cast as Bilbo, it was just like, oh, nothing, they can't do anything wrong. And then the movies came out and I was like, oh.
And the first one, like, it's not amazing, but the first one was still pretty good. Like, I was like, this, like, it's not Lord of the Rings, but like, yeah, this is good. This is good. And then the second and third ones are like, oh, okay, well.
Let me tell you my experience watching The Hobbit. The first one I watched and felt the same. I was like, okay, well, it was fine. I fell asleep midway through the second one and didn't bother with the third. So
I saw the third in the movie theater.
And that one definitely suffered from like, well, we can just make it as long as we want. People like the Lord of the Rings extended version. So
yeah, I mean, they're taking a trilogy and making 3 long movies, and then taking one children's book and making 3 long movies is like, okay,
it's terrible.
Like, maybe 2 movies, but
editing matters. Okay, here's a good Taylor Swift example. In the comments, if you're a Swiftie, let me know. Leanne is not going to understand any of this, but that's okay.
I know things. I know things.
One of the fan favorite songs of Taylor Swift that came out in like 2012, that was never a single, so general population doesn't really know it, was this song called All Too Well. And famously, she said that it used to be a 10-minute song and she cut it down to 5 minutes. And it's one of the most famous songs among like the Swifties, okay? And now she's re-recording all her music. I don't have time to get into that, okay? I don't. If you want to hit me up over DM sometime, people, I can get into it with you. But she's redoing it. And as one of the things to fans, she released the original 10-minute version. So she like,
wait, wasn't there someone famous in the music video for it?
Sadie Sink and Dylan O'Brien.
Okay, yeah.
That's all I know about it.
That's all I know.
Anyway, we can DM about it. Okay, so the point, and she released the 10-minute version, and everyone really loved it. And what I've always said, and people say this a lot, and I've always talked about in these like communities, is like, but if she had released the 10-minute version first, it would not have been a good song, because the editing is what made it such a tight and good song. And now that we all love it, it is so great to hear this long version, and it's great, just like the extended versions are great. But I would submit that the extended versions, like if you saw those first, would not have the same impact as seeing the edited version. And maybe they would. It's a little different, but I do think like we just don't have enough value on editing. So like The Hobbit was like, well, more Hobbit is always better. And it's just like, that's just not true. Like,
I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to bring this up again, but it's the same problem that Fantastic Beasts has, where like J.K. Rowling was like, people wanted to know more about these characters. They wanted to know more, and it's only because they already cared about these characters. They were in stories where they mattered, and then having read those stories, now people wanted to know more. And to mistake that for, oh, people just want tons and tons of lore all of the time, you're like, no, you have to tell a story where we care about it, and then we're gonna ask you about the lore. But I mean, I feel like The Hobbit was like the preview of what the Rings of Power would be, where The Hobbit was much too stretched out. And then the Rings of Power is just like even worse. And like I used this analogy with my brother the other night where I was like, to be Lord of the Rings about it, Rings of Power feels like too little butter spread over too much bread. Like what Bilbo says.
Bilbo says.
Yeah. That's what it feels. There's like, you have like this much plot and you've just stretched it out over 8 episodes and filled in some like CGI visuals, and like versus like House of the Dragon is like a burrito that you can't quite fold over because there's just too much in there.
I feel like I'm gonna need to use that scene now when I do my review. I'm gonna steal that from you and just like open. That will just be the opening. Will just be Bilbo saying it's like too little butter spread over too much bread. I'm just gonna open and be like, that's it.
But that's what it feels like.
I'm actually being serious. I'm just gonna open with that scene now. Thank you for the idea.
You're welcome. And when you review House of the Dragon, you can use the burrito too.
Oh, great. Yeah, I like when you said when I review House of the Dragon. I appreciate that. Yeah, I think, and again, because some people are like, well, some things could be longer. In fact, we just had a conversation about a scene that was cut in Harry Potter when you accidentally watched the extended cuts.
I didn't know there was an extended cut.
And how like, yeah, maybe it could have used that. And it's knowing when. And again, that's just skill. There's just really no way to measure that,
But like with so many, like with books as well, less is usually more. And like one of the reasons Neil Gaiman is such an amazing author, like his art is in his brevity and the fact that he can tell you the entire being of a character in one sentence. And a much worse author will tell you 500 pages and you still don't really feel like you know the character.
I mean, and then but we also like Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which arguably is just so long.
But again, she spent like 10 years on it. I don't think she was like, well, we're keeping everything I wrote because it needs to go to press. Like she considered everything that's in there, and like something can be long. And like, again, like if Rings of Power needs to be 5, like recently, George R.R. Martin, as I think might have been today, said that House of the Dragon to tell its complete story needs 4 seasons, 10 episodes each. Like that's what it needs to tell its story. And like based on season 1, I mean, yeah, they're cramming in as much story as they can. And so if you're telling me that there's so much story that this is the length of time that it takes to tell this story, then great. But if you're just like, here's this amount of time, fill it in with some story, and you're like, okay, I'll just like mosey on around and maybe we'll find a plot along the way. Like something can be long and justify that runtime.
Well, that was my point.
Bad.
That was my point. It's like brevity isn't always the answer. And also length isn't always the answer. It's what do you need to tell the story? And Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell needed every moment to tell the story. I think it's a brilliant book. And there's a lot of stories that I think need every moment of its length to tell the book or tell the story. And there's other ones that don't. And they're short books. I mean, Piranesi is like 200 pages. And I'm obsessed with that book. And it's everything it needed. I mean, Susanna Clarke is great. And also, that's a great example because those were both by Susanna Clarke. You've got like the two extremes from the same author. She knows.
With Neil Gaiman, you have American Gods, this meandering monstrosity, and then you have Ocean at the End of the Lane, which is like barely more than a short story. And like they're authors who, again, like I guess brevity, I think, is always the answer in that everything's story should be as short as it possibly can be and still tell its story. And for some stories, that's still 1,000 pages because like it can't be any shorter than that and tell this story. But that doesn't mean you make it 2,000 pages because more is better, So like a story isn't better because it's longer. It should be like told, it should justify every word, every scene, every minute, whatever, if it's a movie or a book. Like it can be extremely long, but it needs to have a reason to be that long.
Agreed.
Oh, there was a comment up here I missed. Let's see. If you go back and watch interviews with Payne and McKay talking about their care for Tolkien, they are very clearly con men in hindsight. They're pitching their con to this day. Well, it's unfortunate to hear.
I like to try to see the best in the people. And I like to think that they were trying, okay? Because it's painful to think that people weren't trying.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I'm not the optimist that you are. I don't like my life motto in all things is expect the worst and hope for the best. But at the same time, I think my assessment of most things is that I probably don't know the whole story. I'm almost 100% certain that I don't know the whole story. So most of the time, if I can comment on the parts of it that I do know, then I will. But to concretely lay the blame for something at someone's feet, unless like there is some kind of, and even then, like you really can't know. But like most of the time, like there's so much behind the scenes. There's so many people behind these things. There's so many reasons why. I mean, when people will say, like when I complained about Sandman, right? And people were like, Neil Gaiman says it's great, therefore it is. And I'm like, well, first of all, just because he likes it, like I am an independent human being with independent thoughts and feelings, and I can have an opinion independent of the author. So we can disagree about that. That's an option. But also, I don't know if Gaiman actually likes it. I know that he's contractually part of this production and it behooves him to promote it. And like that doesn't mean that I think he's lying, because if I didn't like it, therefore Gaiman doesn't like it. Like I know the truth of it. But like, okay, like Gaiman is promoting it. That means next to nothing. It means that it's based on his work, and maybe he loves it. Maybe he really does, and maybe he doesn't. But just because he tweeted saying the show is great and he's a part of it, like, that doesn't mean anything. And so like if a showrunner like has an interview where they come off saying something a little bit dim and you're like, it's your fault, this sucks. I'm like, I mean, they're not the only ones making this show. They're not the only ones making all the calls. Like you just don't know.
Okay, I got it. Someone said that Payne and McKay say if you don't like it, you're patently evil. I want proof of that. I want to see the quote where the showrunner said, if you don't like it, you're patently evil. I want receipts. I want receipts for that. So that's true. I mean, I'm starting to blame Rafe for Wheel of Time. I didn't at first, and now everything I've read after it came out, they're like, oh yeah, it says everyone didn't like this thing that we did, but I know I'm right, so I'm going to keep doing it. And I was like, okay, now I don't like you. It was about the love triangle between Egwene and Rand and Perrin after he fridged his wife. That didn't exist in the books. Everyone hated that, rightfully, because it made no sense. And he was like, well, fans and everyone has said they didn't like that, but I know what we're about. So
but I think this is a great opportunity to talk about something we haven't talked about really, at least like other than in passing. But changes from the source material, where if an adaptation is not well received, and it did happen to be an adaptation that did change some things, people will say fans don't like it because they require it to be exactly like the book. And I simply don't think that that's the case, that it has to be justified in the story that you are telling. And there's plenty of examples of adaptations that do change things and people are fine with it. But as soon as you change something and people don't like it, oh, you only hate it because it's not like the book. And that's not the case. Like I think this love triangle thing in Wheel of Time, like it's not that this is different from the book, therefore it's bad. It's that it also doesn't make any sense in the story you're telling either.
And I've talked about that a lot. I've said like, at least have consistency in the story you're telling. So if you wanted to do that love triangle, great. And he didn't have a wife and they wanted to make that tension, although I don't like love triangles, period, at least I would have understood it. Like, okay, maybe they're trying to make this tension, but like, you're going to give him a wife that he's supposed to be mourning after killing. Sorry, this is all really big spoilers for the Wheel of Time show, but you shouldn't watch it.
No one cares.
Here's the problem. In big fandoms, there are always going to be misbehaving fans. And in big fandoms, there's always going to be the fans who literally will not nothing if it is not.
There's people that don't like the Lord of the Rings movies and don't like the Dune movie, and
yes.
so there's
because
no
it's not a line of line. It's not a line by line adaptation. There is always a fan, but I do feel like a lot creators get to be defensive and just point to those fans and be like, "See, they'd never be happy," and that can be really frustrating when you're like, "Look, dude, like." I even said that in my Wheel of Time thing. Like when it boiled down to it, I actually found out none of my complaints really had to do with the lore changes. Like some of them did, but very few. It was mostly like, this is just bad choices. Like you're bringing someone back from the dead. That is patently a no-no in all of fantasy. Like to have no cost to bring someone back from the dead is like literally rule number one. And so it is frustrating how discourse about adaptations has fueled things.
You're wrong, Urza.
I kind of want to Google this. I know I shouldn't be researching during a live show, but I cannot believe people who don't like Rings of Power patently evil.
I thought you were looking at Dune.
Let's see. Showrunner calls some of the Rings of Power backlash patently evil. Okay, see, that's very, very different. Because if they're calling the racist people patently evil, like that's not necessarily the same thing.
Which, I mean, this is the same
So
thing that happened with Star Wars, where like anyone who said that the new movies were bad were like, that's because you're a bigot. And you're like, no. Well, this is why I also, I mean, I plan at some point, spoilers, to do a video about this. So, you know, stay tuned. But I think as much as we've talked about, okay, so Rings of Power and House of the Dragon airing at the same time. Obviously, everyone's comparing them because, of course, they are. The studios basically want you to at that point. But a lot of the criticisms that people have about Rings of Power, and then the way that they're told, you know, like, oh, you just can't handle that Galadriel's a strong female character. That's why you hate this show. Well, we currently have House of the Dragon running, which has like a substantially female cast with strong female characters, and no one has a problem with it. Like the same thing with the racism thing. Like there are characters of color that are portrayed kind of strangely in Rings of Power. Like we said, like why is there just the one? Why aren't there more? Why isn't there a whole village like this? Why this doesn't make any sense? Like it feels like tokenizing that you have just the one. Like so you can have a problem with that and they're like, "Oh, you're racist." You're like, "No, cuz like they did it well in House of the Dragon." Like no one has a huge, I mean, okay, obviously someone. There's always someone. But like for the most part, people don't have a problem with House Velaryon being black in House of the Dragon.
well, so you hit on a lot of different things, which like first, like we've both made videos about the female representation thing and how we can't pretend every representation is good. It will make bad characters, which is why at the end of my race video I just did, I said, yes, there are plenty of legitimate criticisms about how race is used. And if we don't talk about them, then representation doesn't get better. But I'm kind of still on this article thing about what Payne said, because I do think it's unfair when we take their words out of context in the same way that they're taking the fandom out of context, because they're clearly talking about the racist comments that did come out when we saw Arendur and stuff. Now, I think that was a small part of the fandom? Yes. And do I think it's annoying that they like to make that a bigger deal to make the fans seem
Well, I was about
crazy?
to say, I feel like where I would agree with you that, you know, it's not fair to do that, but where I stop having patience for it is if they are asked a very good faith question, you know, like, so people are criticizing the show saying that like the story isn't that good or that they're not liking these characters. What do you say to that? And if their only answer is like, well, some of these fans are racist, you're like, well, that didn't answer the question. Like you're just pointing to the worst actors and like ignoring the legitimate criticism because it's easy to do that.
Yeah, and this even says the angry babies cry the loudest, so they get the attention. And even this article says there are a lot of legitimate reasons to not like Rings of Power. So I'm just saying this quote, I get frustrated also when we take these out of context because it furthers the idea that fans aren't, like, no one's listening to each other. And yeah, anyway, I just don't think we can use that quote. That's all. I'm all about the research here, people. And we can't keep taking people out of context. But anyway, one thing I talked about is it's like they take one tweet and then they report on it, and then the other people report on it, and then someone else reports on it. And so now everybody thinks that that tweet is 10,000 tweets, and it was one tweet that someone said something about it, which is why I also hate the internet, which we're on right now. But
I do think that there's something to the sort of diversity armor, almost like plot armor, where that is, like we said, like it's not fair to take it out of context, and it's equally unfair for them to just say, if you dislike the show, then you must be racist. You know, like
absolutely,
that's the narrative.
It's both stupid.
Yeah.
It's both stupid, and that's why I just feel like, are we ever going to get anywhere with criticizing these shows if like all it is just like this pissing contest? Because that's why like it feels like.
That's why I do really enjoy the fact that we have a currently airing comparison with House of the Dragon to point to and be like, strong females and diversity. Like it's literally happening simultaneously, and people are not having those problems with that show. So like if you're going to tell me that it's only because people are bigoted that they dislike Rings of Power, we currently have an example to show you, ready to go. Didn't you have to dig that up and be like, I don't think so.
And Wheel of Time had a lot of that too, because the showrunners really thought they were doing something, making the dragon able to be a man or a woman. They were like, well, we're making it equal. And it was like, well, you kind of actually harmed the female characters. Like I talked about this a lot. Like Egwene in particular, I thought was very, very harmed by that narrative, because in the book, her whole story is about how she is like, I'm coming with you. And it's her choice. She is the agency motivator. And then all of a sudden they made this change and now she's just pulled along. And it's like, well, who was the stronger character? Just because you say she can be the dragon doesn't make her stronger. It's like this lack of knowledge about what real characters are. And that's what it is, right? Okay, so throwing diversity in, but not actually making someone a good character. It all comes back to writing, right? No one's going to notice colorblind casting if everyone is a character that's great and acts. I mean, you might notice it. You might say this doesn't make a ton of sense, but
well, again, this is where I would point to Shadow and Bone. I appreciated the fact that, like, I mean, I don't think the show would have sucked if they had just made Alina Asian and said, you know, that okay, we're gonna have Alina and Mal be people of color and just cast it that way. Like, the show would have been fine. But it actually made the story richer and better and had more depth and nuance to those characters. The fact they wrote into the story that this is part of what made those characters bond with each other is the way that they had been othered because they were non-white in a predominantly white environment. And that's why they do stand out, and their standing out affects them to this day. And you see like sort of like in-universe racist sort of like signage that then like they themselves are confronted with. And like it just brought more depth and more nuance and more conflict. And it just made it a richer story because instead of just saying, oh, look, we made them diverse, but didn't do anything in the story where we could actually do something with that or make it make sense or add to their characters in this way. Like that's, you can make the story better by doing that. And to not do that is a missed opportunity.
Yeah. And there's two things in the comment that I feel like I want to address. The first is that woke casting can be a red flag and they can forgive it if the show is good. I think that's a bad thing to say. Like we forgave that they did diversity. No, they wanted to include diversity, and in House of the Dragon, they did it properly. And so I don't think it's forgiving anything. It's a good thing no matter what. And I'm tired of pretending that like constantly having all white fantasy is a must. Like
I can't speak for you, Mr. X. I don't know what you meant by that, but if they mean that lore fans, you know, people who would be like, this breaks the lore of this book, but because you did this so well in this show that I forgive it. So if that's what they mean, then like there is, I guess there would stand truth to that.
I can get that. And then someone saying I'm being naive about RP. I'm not even defending the showrunners. They're making a garbage show, but I refuse to take them out of context. I do, because that's what's happening on the internet. And it's something I'm very vocal about on my channels. I'm just tired of everyone taking everyone out of context. To pretend that they said everyone who doesn't like the show is patently evil is not what they said. It's not. I just read it. I looked it up, guys. I Googled it while we were here.
She did.
It's
we all saw.
What they said. Now, do I think that they're sticking their heads in the sand because they want to pretend their show is good, so they're only paying attention to the reviews that they can say, look, that's racist? Totally.
Which, to defend them a little more than even you are, I don't know that that's true, that they personally are ignoring the actual criticism they're seeing. But when you are doing an interview to promote your show and you get thrown a hardball question like people are saying it sucks, what do you say to that? I mean, PR 101 is you don't say they're right, it does suck. And we really messed that up, didn't we? Like, no, like it would be a terrible PR strategy. Of course, they're going to say, well, how can we spin this? Well, we're going to spin it by saying, well, they're racist. Because that's what PR is. It's just why I'm always like, I don't know. I don't know who decided this. I don't know who wrote this. I don't know who was the one that signed off on it. And we will never know.
That's such a good point too. Like, do you really expect the showrunners to come out and be like, you're right, we did do an oopsie?
I mean, maybe years later. I think Stephen King said that about one of his, I think the first Dark Tower book. The like introduction or like the foreword from the author for Dark Tower is Stephen King being like, yeah, this book sucks, but you know, if you're willing to sit through it, then the next ones are better. So like, okay.
Yeah, and I think what would really show that showrunners were taking things to heart would be the next season, right? So like for me, I'm very interested to watch Wheel of Time season 2 and be like, was this all him posturing? Are they actually going to try? No, I don't think they will. I just don't. And I think I'm going to probably quit Wheel of Time season 2. That's my prediction. We'll find out. But it'd be interesting. What about if Rings of Power, what if the next season all of a sudden is going a lot faster and is doing all this stuff? Then you might be like,
they overcorrect.
I don't want over, but it would be interesting, you know? It would be interesting.
But if you were casting Rings of Power, what would you do? I don't know if they mean for like the characters we are, like given the story that we did already have, like if we would have cast it differently. Because I don't people who are saying that the actors in Rings of Power suck, I don't know that. I don't know that that's not true because I really haven't seen them in much else. Maybe they do suck. But I think it would be a rare actor that could make this story good. Like, I don't think that it's their fault. And also, it's
Mhm.
often not just the story, but the direction. You know, like a director
Yes.
can get a bad performance out of a good actor.
Yeah, and it's hard to say. Like sometimes I look at the Galadriel and I'm like, did they cast her because she looks perfect? Because if we're just going by like pure, like you see a photo of her, yes. Like
She is very short though to be Galadriel.
yes. I mean that's one of the problems I think with the show is that Galadriel acts very human.
All the
You
elves do,
know,
not just Galadriel.
yes, all the elves do. All the elves act very human, which again adds to that layer of why the human elf relationship isn't feeling
Well,
interesting.
I hadn't actually thought of it this way until I saw, and I do not remember which video. My brother showed it to me, a video talking about Rings of Power, and they pointed this out. And like, I just have generally kind of checked out in any like meaningful criticism when I watch it. I'm not like, oh, this story could be so good if they did this. I'm just not there. I'm just like, this is stupid. This makes no sense. Like, I'm just not thinking about how to improve it because I just don't care enough. But when they pointed out, and I was like, actually, yes, that by itself would make it so much better. Is that the fact that elves should be quite different from humans and should be quite unemotional. They live for thousands of years. They would be more detached. And that Arondir, who like feels kinship with humans and feels affection for a human, should be the most human-like of them all. But actually, every elf in the show is like emotional and mean and very human-like. And Arondir is the only one that's kind of stoic and distant. And you're like, this should be the other way around. And just that, your story would feel realer because you'd be like, elves are distant and removed, except Arondir, because he feels like one of the lads and wants to be with the humans. Like, why is it the other way around?
Well, and it's shocking to me, and I talked about this in one of my videos that Kate Blanchett and oh shoot, who's the actress for Galadriel right now? I knew her name, but I forgot it.
Morfydd Clark.
Morfydd Clark. They're the same age when they played Galadriel. Did you know that?
No.
Kate Blanchett was 30 when
Those
she
movies are so
portrayed
old.
Galadriel. And Morfydd Clark is like 32 or something. Yeah, I think she's 32. So she's 2 years older. And I said, Kate Blanchett, she feels 2,000 years old when she plays Galadriel, you know? And
I mean,
Morfydd
Arwen
Clark,
feels
Arwen, yes.
old.
And Morfydd Clark feels 32. And I'm not blaming her because I don't know. I've never seen her in anything. I am blaming the writing though.
And again, the directing, and there's a lot of people
There's a
involved in
lot
making
of
her like
things.
this.
And I think that, yeah, it missed the mark in that way. I don't even know what the point I was going to make was about that. Just that, well, we're talking about casting. Someone asked us about casting. So I think it's hard to answer. Like you said, the casting, I think if the story was different, the casting could be fine. That's what we'll never know. Like,
I guess, I mean, we would know if we saw them either improve second season or see these actors, do something different. Because there's been times when an actor is in something that is much more well known, and then I happen to know them because I like saw them. It's usually British actors because I watch a lot of British TV. So like obscure British TV that no one in America has seen. And then they get their big break in some Hollywood movie and everyone's like, this is a terrible actor. They can't act. And I'm like, they actually can. I've seen them in small budget British television, like, give an Oscar winning performance. So to say that, they're a bad actor. Sometimes like Tommy Wiseau, I don't think that's a situation where like, maybe he'd be a great actor in something else. But like a lot of the time, like, you don't know that it was the actor unless you've seen them do a bad job over and over and over in multiple different things.
Agreed. And I always joke about like Natalie Portman. Like the first movie I ever saw Natalie Portman in was Star Wars. And especially the second and third ones, I used to think, oh, Natalie Portman isn't that great of an actress. And then I saw her in literally every other thing she's ever been in. And I was like, oh, so it was Star Wars and it wasn't Natalie Portman. So I mean, yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh no, yeah. I was like, there's no one in Rings of Power right now that I'm like is so terrible that I'm like, there's no way it's something else. There's no one I feel that way about.
Yeah.
That's it.
I mean, I feel like the actors they have are fine, probably. Like, even if none of them are like brilliant, amazing actors that are destined to win an Oscar someday in something else, like maybe you don't have to be that great. Like, honestly, like the acting in Lord of the Rings is good, but it's not the kind of thing that requires that much acting. Like, it's the story and then looking stoic a lot of the time is what carries it. And like, you happen to just natively look elven. And then if you look into the middle distance, we're like, they are ancient and thinking deep thoughts. You know, like it's a lot of stuff. It's like we want to say, oh, they're such a good actor, but like, I mean, Kate Blanchett is a lot. It's just that she's a very like I think I told you before. There's a joke in The Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt that I laughed at for days because someone was like, Kate Blanchett is such a great actress, and someone else is like, is she, or is she just tall? Because like you know you can't.
A lot of good lines.
They're just like there is something. She's a tall, beautiful, statuesque, you know, natively elvish looking woman, and she just stands there in a beautiful dress and with completely blank expression, and people are like, wow, she plays the role of Galadriel so brilliantly. And I'm like, she just looks like an elf naturally, had a great costume, and stood completely still while we filmed her for a second. Like, that didn't take great acting. I mean, there are scenes where she does good acting to, like, I'm not saying she doesn't, but a lot of it is just like, that didn't require great acting.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. I'm sorry, I'm just distracted by this troll in here who's saying something about every comma and period champions diversity. I don't even know what that means, but they've said it like 30 times. So there, we gave it attention. Now stop spamming it. I don't know what you mean. We're liars because of it, apparently. So, you know what? Liene and I aren't that affected by mean comments. I just want to let that person know. We get mean comments a lot. So like, it rolls off. I just wanted to let everyone know that in the chat. Anyway, I like what this person said, presence. Some people have presence. And I do think Kate Blanchett is someone who has presence, which is why, like you said, she doesn't have to do a lot because she's present. Yeah.
Well, if you could choose and have creative input on a future adaptation, what would it be? First law. I'm awaiting the call.
What capacity? So what capacity? You have to choose a capacity. So it can be like casting director. It can be like an editor. It can
Casting
be like
director.
Okay, I knew you were going to pick that. So
I've already did a fan cast.
In mind? Do you have someone in mind?
For who?
Anyone. You said you want to be casting director,
yes.
So casting direct.
So Glocta must be Sam Claflin. Tom Hardy must be Logan Ninefingers.
Sam Claflin. Okay. Yeah. They'd have to make him ugly, but I guess it makes sense because so super attractive in the beginning.
Yeah, and he's young. He's like 30.
I forget that. I always forget that. You know, that's one reason I really like Sharp Ends. That is it the first story in Sharp Ends where you get to see Glocta pre everything. Yeah, that was a great short story for me because I visualized Glocta too old because of who he was in the first law.
I feel like most fan castings that I've seen pitch somebody who's quite old, and I'm like, Glocta's 30. He's just broken.
Okay, I like this. Sam Claflin. Okay, give me more. That was a good one. And I knew him, and I barely know any actors, so that's exciting.
Tom Hardy is Logan Ninefingers.
I knew it. He
goes berserker so well.
I just knew it. I was going to say, so who are you having Tom Hardy play? Okay.
Logan. Tell me he wouldn't be a good Logan.
Okay. Who else?
Well, so I originally, for Baez, it might have been Kyle? Maybe not. Somebody pitched me their casting for Baez, and I liked it better than mine. Graham McTavish.
I don't know who that is.
He's an Outlander in House of the Dragon, which I don't think you've seen either of those. But I think if you looked him up, you would concur that he'd be a good Baez.
I'll look him up after this. That's a good one. Do you have anyone for Artie? I just really like Artie.
Well, I do, but I don't think it's kind of like what I said with the Darkling, where I thought Cillian Murphy should play the Darkling, but not now because now he's too old. But also Ben Barnes is too old. So if he can play it, then okay. Then back to my original suggestion, make it Cillian Murphy.
Ben Barnes in every live we do.
But so like I pictured Artie basically as Haley Atwell, Agent Carter from.
Oh.
But she's now a bit too old. But like
she's too old now. But yeah, she would have been great. That's a great picture for him. Okay, I like that. Casting director first thought. If I had a hand in anything,
Sanderson.
That's a good question. It might surprise people. I don't want to hand in anything Sanderson. Yeah, I just don't think I would. I think
I know what you're gonna end up saying, even if you don't know what it is yet.
Can you tell me? Tell me what I think. Sometimes I need that help.
Well, you've spoken to the author quite a few times.
Okay, I was gonna say, I knew you were gonna say Dandelion Dynasty. That's funny. That's what I was gonna guess. Yeah, Dandelion Dynasty. That would be interesting. either if it was Dandelion Dynasty, or even I guess if I did like a Sanderson one, for me, I'd want to be in the role of editor. I'd want to just be the person where they like showed all the completed writed scripts and I could just be like, that's stupid. And I wouldn't even tell them how to fix it. My only job would to be like, that's stupid and needs to change.
Was
Or
it
I'd
you
be
that I
like,
was talking to where I was like, I don't want to be hired to write anything. I just want to be hired to read your script and be like, no, that doesn't make sense.
yes,
Fix
I
it.
just exactly. I just want to be like, no, fix it. Nope,
I can't write
no,
it better for you, but no.
no. I know it's wrong. Like that's just the role I want because I feel like
Oh yeah, it
it
was
would.
you. I was saying that like basically like the person that tests security systems by finding flaws in it. I want to be
Yes.
that person for plots where I'm like hole,
Well, it's
flaw,
like the
flaw,
professional
flaw.
hackers, right? Professional, that's a job where they go and try to
Yeah,
break the thing and they work for the
exactly.
company.
I want
That's
to do
what I
that for
want to do.
plots.
I do think like Dandelion Dynasty would be a fun one to do that for. The reason I'd say I wouldn't necessarily want to do it for Sanderson is I think it'd be really hard for me with Sanderson to let go of some things that I really wanted that may not serve an adaptation. So like for
That's
sure,
why
not
I can
War
only
for
do
the
casting for First Law. I can't, otherwise it would be page for page. I would have Stephen Pacey dub all the dialogue so that it would sound like the audiobook.
Yeah, and so like there is that. I'm just like I'm looking at my shelf. What else do I like? I don't know.
I mean, Greenbone just would be an amazing adaptation. I just don't know what I could contribute to that.
That's how I feel. You know, maybe like Sword of Kaigen. Like I could be a
Mhm.
great no person on Sword of Kaigen because I already kind of feel that way about the book where like I gave it 5 stars or whatever. I love that book, but there's some things I was like, no. And I just want to be like, no.
Yeah.
So that would be a good one. I literally have to look at my shelf. I don't know. That's probably Dandelion Dynasty would be really fun. I would like that one
And
a
you'd get
lot.
to
That
work
would make
side by side with Ken Liu. You're already friends. Honestly, that'd be the
buddies,
best
right?
part of working on First Law would be like if I got to like work side by side with Joe Abercrombie.
They know who we are. We exist to them, so it would be fine. Yeah, I think that would be fun. I would love if Dandelion Dynasty became. I'd probably be a show. Would you think Dandelion Dynasty would be a good show?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it could
I
be
mean,
a good
I
show.
feel
I
like
do think
it's like a lot of these where there's just like if you did like I think a competent writer, if it would be almost unrecognizable, but you could like strip it down and make it much simpler and make a good movie, but it would be very, very different from the book. So if you wanted something that was more loyal to the book, it would need to be a show.
yeah, but something like Greenbone, I think, could make an excellent movie. I think you would lose some things, but I think it could be a good.
But at the
good
same time,
movie.
I think a disciplined miniseries of, you know, like the way the British do it, where it's like 5 episodes, 6 episodes, like tight. Like it would be because like you would lose a lot if you did make it a movie. So, and I like, you know, because I already think of Greenbone as Peaky Blinders, and Peaky Blinders is a TV show, but it is like quite each season is quite short. So like if it was like
We need to bring back
tight.
the miniseries. I mean, that's what made Good Omens so good, right?
Mhm.
It was just a miniseries. I think they were only like 40-minute episodes. I don't
Yeah.
think they were super long, if I remember.
Well, and there's also like so with books, except for that trend of splitting the last one into 2 movies, in general, at least you have the security of like there is an end point to this as opposed to the TV show that outstays its welcome and just keeps going and going and going. So like a lot of TV, it's like that's what's scary about Rings of Power. Is like with Lord of the Rings, you're like these are the books and this is where it ends, and we can't just keep it going because this is where it ends. So Rings of Power, because there isn't actually a story we're adapting here, so they're just gonna keep going. I don't know where we're going to, but
Yeah, and it's interesting because like Rings of Power and Wheel of Time claim like that they have a set, or at least Rings of Power does like a set amount of seasons, which in theory makes it sound good. I mean, and some shows do. Like I always respect Breaking Bad because they said they had 5 seasons worth of content, and they sure did, and they stopped. No matter it was so popular, and they stopped, and that story is better for it.
I feel like I was actually thinking when I said it of the show, the German show Dark, where they were like, we have a 3-season story and that's it. And this is, and when you watch it, like, yeah, like they have a very, I don't know, very disciplined plotting where like, this is clearly the arc they always meant to tell. It's a complicated and interconnected. And it's the same thing of like, it's not too short or too long. This is the amount of time we require to tell this story. And having that discipline. And I think typically non-American shows, British ones and other European shows are better about that. Americans are like 20 episodes a season, 20 seasons. Let's just go forever.
The Office is the perfect example. The British Office had 2 seasons and like an extra episode. And The Office went until everyone didn't like it anymore because that's capitalism, I guess. I don't know. It's just as long as we're making money, then that's all that matters, and that does hurt a show.
I think I watched 1 or 2 episodes of Merlin. I don't know if you ever watched it.
Merlin was so great. And you know what Merlin was? Merlin's what you talked about, Lana. They did not have budget. You watch that show and you're like, wow, that looks really bad. There's a dragon in that show and you're like, that's not good. But
a show that
show had heart.
A show that was kind of ruined by looking better and having budget was Doctor Who, because it also looks kind of crappy, like, to begin with, because it's a show that has a built-in mechanism to keep going and to like regenerate. So like that's very clever on the people that invented Doctor Who, because you can totally recast it every few years and it still fits the story. Like there's a built-in reason to do that. But like it was like a campy show, and as soon as it got a budget and like gravitas, now it's like Rings of Power. You're like, you take yourself so seriously, as opposed to being this like campy show about this like
Doctor Who
guy that travels in a phone booth. Like,
because Doctor Who is campy, and Merlin is campy. Merlin is absolutely campy, and I loved every second of it because it's campy the entire way.
And I wish Sandman had been campy. It should have been.
Well, I neither liked the graphic novel nor the show, so I can't talk about
you.
So I'm sorry. I mean, the graphic novel was fine. I didn't like hate it or anything.
I mean, we would have a problem if you were like, the graphic novel sucked, thank God the show was brilliant. Then I'd be like, okay, that's friendship.
I only watched 2 episodes of the show, and then I was like, well, I better read the graphic novel. And then I read the graphic novel. I was like, hey, I don't need to finish the show. that was the pipeline of Sandman for me. Anyway.
I thought I would bring this up sooner, but actually I thought going into this live that I'd bring it up, like an example of something really, really changing the story, and me thinking that I was a great idea, and it's not, and I like the book as well, but the Count of Monte Cristo film, they made a huge change to the ending of it, and I love that change, and I love watching the interview with I don't know if it was the director or the writer, but whoever was responsible for the change. He was like talking about when he decided to do that, and how he was like his experience of reading the book and deciding that this is how the story goes. And he was like, Dumas, how did you miss that? Of course, this is what happens. The way he's like feeling like the author is the one that's like, you messed up. You meant to write it like this. You missed it.
Count of Monte Cristo is hard for me because somehow I had never seen that movie despite everyone loving it. And I've read that book like 2 years ago and then saw the movie. The movie's way better for commercial audiences, like way better. And I understand why everyone loves it. I will say it does really miss the point of the novel, though. The novel was like, revenge sucked. Like he spent literally like 40 years on revenge. And then at the end,
it was a happier ending.
This is hollow and nothing. Although I will say, is her name Mercedes? Did I make that up? What's her name?
Mercedes.
Okay. Mm-hmm. The ending for Mercedes, though, in the book is trash. I was like, really? None of this was her fault. Come on. So I think appreciate that the movie was like, oh, we'll make it happy and nice.
I think what I was just talking about was the ending. I think the best change that it made, and the ending could have been the book ending still, is the fact that while there was a collective of people that conspired against him, making it this true betrayal between him and Fernand, where it's not just, oh, he's one of the many dudes that had a potential stake in screwing him over. The true visceral like betrayal and hatred that there is between Edmund and Fernand in the movie. I thought like it just makes it a lot more, it gets the audience a lot more like, oh, how could he do that to you? Like that you're invested in seeing this pay off.
And I'll say like, you couldn't, I mean, I guess someone could, but yeah, adapting the Count of Monte Cristo as written, it's just never going to go over, really. I guess maybe if you made a TV show, I just don't think it would. Yeah. I really liked the book.
But also Dumas was paid by the word, and it shows.
For sure. And yes, I listened to it, and were there times where I was like, these French names all sound exactly the same, and I'm unsure who is who? Yes.
And you also kind of were like, wait, we've been here for a while. What does this have to do with the main plot?
Oh, there's definitely a lot of that. So yeah, I appreciate it for what it is. I do like the message more of the original, although it always bothered me that the main character saw him as a son and then left him out to dry because apparently that's okay. So I did love that part of the movie. It felt better. You watch that movie and you feel, oh, heart, and you don't read the book and feel that way. So like, I appreciate for that. But if we're talking about that, I don't think you've read it, but another adaptation that did that and did very well was The Bourne Identity.
I haven't read it, but I do love those movies. My dad read them, and he told me some of the differences when the movies were coming out.
Very different. Like the core idea is there, but it's very different. And both the book was good, but the movies are just like really excellent. Mm-hmm. And so I only read the first book though, so I I don't know how they differed in the other ones, but that was another one that I think did a good job. And, you know, Jurassic Park. Jurassic Park, loved the book, and I think the movie also did a really good job.
Yeah, I haven't read the book either, but I saw the movie when I was a kid. I haven't seen it in a very long time. Mostly I have freshest in my brain the new Jurassic Park movies, which is another example of like missing the point.
I only saw the first one. I wouldn't torture myself with the other ones. Everyone's like,
I just watched Jenny Nicholson review them.
Well, I watched the first one, unfortunately.
Yes, they are very dad books, the Born Identity.
Those are very dad books. I know. I used to read my dad's books. You know, the Michael Crichton and the whoever writes Born.
Robert Ludlum.
Yes, that was the one I was forgetting. Robert Ludlum. How did you know? Those are all the dad books.
So I have a father.
You have a father who reads, and whoever writes what are those books? Oh my gosh, Jack Reacher books.
Oh yeah, I don't remember, but yeah. Well, I don't think this is the author of Jack Reacher, but John Grisham books are also very.
Oh, John Grisham. That's actually who I was thinking about. All those. I read The Firm. Isn't that a John Grisham book?
Yeah. I don't think I read The Firm, but I have read a couple John Grisham books. There's something to be said for a page turner. They do keep your attention.
Totally. Although I made my dad read Greenbone Saga, and he really, really liked it. So
I'm trying to get my dad.
Now I get to give him books now.
I did give my dad Grace of Kings because my dad's an engineer, and I was like, okay, the parts of this book that I don't like, you will love. Read this.
You know, my dad's funny. My dad studied engineering too, but I think those are too long. He still needs the like snappy pacing. I don't think he would get through.
My dad's read Stormlight Archive a couple of times, so I think he can handle Dandelion Dynasty.
I mean, I've read Stormlight Archive a couple of times, Liana. Some of us have taste. I don't know what to tell you. Your dad seems like a good. No, I'm just kidding.
I know.
No, but that was one that was fun. That it's fun when you get to give the other directions.
Oh yeah, he does also love Master and Commander.
Classic dad love. Classic.
Mm-hmm. My dad also like.
Thank you. Yes.
The way that we were talking about like showrunners like running something into the ground because like, oh, this was good, and then let's just do that all the time. That's my dad with like one joke in a movie that he thinks is good, and then we'll tell that joke over and over again where it's not appropriate to do so. So Master and Commander, if you've seen it, there's a part where he's like they're like eating dinner, and there's like because they're on a ship, there's like weevils in their bread, and the doctor says if you had to choose which one of these two weevils, which one would you choose? And the punchline is, well, of course, you would choose the lesser of the two weevils. Yeah, I've heard that joke about 100 times, and I've seen the movie twice.
Does your dad watch your channel? Is he going to be sad that you're roasting him right now?
Oh, I roast him when he's doing it every time. And I'm like, okay, here it comes.
Good. So we made people mad. That felt good.
So unexpected.
So unexpected. I feel like we had some good conversations though about adaptations. I think
we talked about good adaptations, not just bad ones.
Yeah, we did. We talked about good ones. What was else on the list of the good ones? I don't know. I think of like Hunger Games for me, Good Omens, Six of Crows. I know it wasn't Six of Crows, but that's just what I'm going to call it because that was the part. I actually was like, literally, like, I kind of want to watch that show again, but I'm just going to skip to the Six of Crows part as much. And maybe Mal. I'll just look at his face sometimes in between the scenes.
Also, Bagra training Alina, just Bagra and Alina together.
Yeah. Again, yeah, she's cool too. I think it's all really about writing and having someone who actually understands the core material. Because if you understand it, then
and the medium that they're adapting it into.
Yes. Understand film and understand what it is. Because if you understand the core theme or the core identities of the characters, then changing plot points won't matter. And that's when people say like something grabbed the feel of something. Actually, you know what a good example of this is? I'll be honest, I don't love the Harry Potter movies. I'm too close to the source material. I read it too many times. But one thing that surprised me is there was a scene in the 7th movie that a lot of people criticized, and I loved it, which was very surprising. And it's the scene where Hermione and Harry dance to the radio. People hated that scene. Do you remember that scene at all?
I do, but like I don't remember feeling any kind of way about it, like good or
It
bad.
was Ron was gone and they danced, and everyone was like, "This was such a stupid scene. It wasn't in the book." Blah 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 blah. And I liked it because one thing you feel about Ron and Hermione in the seventh book is their deep friendship, and especially brotherly sisterly friendship. And
You mean Harry and
people always were
Hermione?
trying to ship him, but it was never that way in the books. And for some reason, that scene where he's like trying to cheer her up and dancing was such a like brother sister scene that even though it wasn't in the book, I felt like it got to the core of what you saw in those moments. And like there were so many things that technically were in the books that I did not like how they portrayed in the movie. And here was a new scene, but got for me to like an emotion. And I
Mhm.
think that is what so much is missing is like it's not about the plot, it's about the emotion, it's about who the people are. And
Well,
in Lord of the Rings, sorry, you go.
I was gonna say, I feel like it boils down to it doesn't matter did the character do this, it matters would the character do this.
Yes. Yes, and I think that the someone was talking about Arwen. I don't know if they
Sorry
were
that
saying
you
this.
didn't get notified. You can replay it forever.
um you know, where they chose to put Arwen in places she wasn't in the Lord of the Rings books. But I think they did it in a way that was still very true to who she was and how she felt. And so
Mhm,
that's really the core of it. I think you could have a show where they adapted everything perfectly and it still wouldn't be good if like the
mhm.
heart, like you keep saying, it just the heart has to be there.
Yeah, and I
Also,
feel
I'm glad
like
I guess a lot of people liked that song, that scene, which was really nice because most people hated it. That makes me feel happy.
yeah, yeah, I mean, there's obviously it's never like one thing that makes or breaks something, but like it is I guess understanding is the best way to boil it down. You have to understand the story and understand the medium that you're using because what works in a book doesn't work in a movie, what works in a movie doesn't work in a book. Like if you know the story intimately, then you can be creative about translating that into what works in a movie. But if you don't understand one of those things, it'll fall apart. If you only understand the story and not film, it'll go badly. If you only understand film but nothing about the core of the story, then maybe you'll make something pretty and cinematic, but it won't be that story. You have to have both. Sometimes that takes two different people working together, one that understands the story and one that understands film. Ideally, like Peter Jackson and Denis Villeneuve, you have somebody all in one that understands the material and the medium.
Yeah, and that's hard to get, I guess.
It's
Yeah.
almost like you can't manufacture it in like a cookie cutter, streamline, mass produced way.
No, and that's the problem is things are becoming mass produced. I mean, even when did Good Omens come out, the show on Amazon? It was a while ago.
I think it's like 3 years at this point, maybe
It
4.
has to be
I
more
think
than
it's
3
3
years.
years.
I think it has to be more than 3 years. Let's see. Good Omens TV show.
Maybe 4
Look at this.
years.
Oh, wow. It was only 3 years. Gosh, what? It's because it was pre-COVID. That seems like a literal lifetime ago for me.
But it was like right before
Um,
COVID.
yeah, yeah, 3 years ago. But this is silly because it was only 3 years ago. But I think even since then, the whole streaming thing has heated up like
Oh yeah,
exponentially.
100%.
When we see how sheer amount of content that's trying to be created today, and that doesn't not always the case, but it just doesn't necessarily leave room for art.
3-movie Piranesi adaptation.
Can you imagine? Honestly, though, like, see, I don't think Piranesi should be adapted. How would you possibly adapt Piranesi
I
in
mean, I guess
any
I would say
meaningful way?
never say never because Denis Villeneuve could show up and do it because there's books like
But
Dune
didn't
where you're
have
like,
things happening in it at least. Like, I feel like
I feel like it could
I
be
don't
a
know. You're right.
film and it wouldn't be a very long film, but a skilled director and screenwriter could make something of that would rely a lot on atmosphere and visual storytelling rather than outright storytelling. Like it could be
You're
done.
right.
That's the same way that Dune is like that's why it was like unadaptable unless you had the stupid voiceovers of people's thoughts. But like Denis Villeneuve proved that you could tell this story and take out that really stupid part of the movie
The
before.
part.
So thank you very much.
It's
Um
true.
is yeah, I mean House of the Dragon, yeah. I feel personally attacked by the fact that you don't watch it.
Good. You and Kyle can just eventually
To
die and
be
roll in your graves
completely
over it.
It might be recency bias, I'll allow, but I personally I feel like if I could force you to watch one thing, or maybe not one thing in the world, but between Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon, I would rather force you to watch House of the Dragon, because I do at this point, and again, it might just be because I'm sour about how Game of Thrones ended, but at this point, I feel like House of the Dragon is better than Game of Thrones, and I also think that you personally would just like House of the Dragon better because of what the story is focused on and what types of things we're dealing with in the story. Like, I just think it would
You don't
appeal
think
to
it's
you more.
weird to just watch House of the Dragon, having
No.
neither read nor
Well,
watched any Game of Thrones?
this is one of the things that, like, again, not to compare constantly Rings of Power and House of the Dragon, but like the way that Rings of Power like relies on you knowing something about Tolkien and is like, you're only gonna like the scene where Elrond is like Mithril. Like, if you'd never heard of Tolkien before, you'd be like, why are we
What's
slowly
Mithril?
telling me the name of a rock? I don't understand why this matters. So like it's like requiring you to know something and expects you to know something. You could watch House of the Dragon and never have seen Game of Thrones or read any of the books and be engaged by the story that it is telling.
Okay. Okay.
I think. Feel free to disagree. Anyone in the chat who's like, nah, you have to have read everything. I think you could, because my mom,
I said the
I mean, she
same thing,
did
but I
watch
think you
Game
guys
of
are
Thrones,
liars
but
because you just want me to watch the show that bad that you'll say literally anything. Next, it'll be like, I don't know, you're going to say something like, this person shows up, and it like doesn't, but you'll say it just so I'll watch the TV show at this point.
what, in Rings of Power?
Hmm?
When people are telling you that someone shows up, you mean in Rings of Power?
No, I mean like in House of the Dragon. Like I feel like you'll be like it, like you'll just pretend that like like my favorite actor.
Rosamund Pike
like,
is in it.
Yeah, I mean she's not even my favorite. She's only, you know what I'm just saying. You're gonna say somebody, or you're gonna be like, did you know there's a Brandon Sanderson tie-in? So you better watch House of the Dragon.
George R.R. Martin would never.
Liene, the point is you're trying to get me to watch it. I'm telling you, you're gonna lie about it so that I will watch it.
I wouldn't. I don't lie.
You know what?
Friends
else George
don't
R. R.
lie.
Will never do? Finish Game of Thrones. So you know, there's a lot of things George R. R. Martin will never do.
Friends
going there.
don't lie.
Friends don't lie. It's so true.
I learned that from Netflix. Yeah, they haven't read it. I mean, I feel like most people. Well, I shouldn't say.
Well, I think most people haven't read it.
Yeah.
But I feel like a lot of people have probably seen Game of Thrones, though, at the very least.
Yeah, but also it's been long enough that a casual viewer would remember quite little about Game of Thrones and could pick up House of the Dragon and be like, oh yeah, is this the same universe as that other thing that I watched casually a few years ago? Huh, okay. Dragons. Cool, let's do it. You know, like you don't have to know anything about it because like what you need to know for the story, it tells you.
Is there? Yeah,
and it doesn't really have that much.
That's definitely an interesting point. And something I talked about Wheel of Time, which is why I interviewed people who hadn't read the books, is, you know, did that show rely on fans' knowledge? And I argued that it did, which was bad because it also wasn't presenting to fans. Like if you're going to rely on fans' knowledge, you want fans to like the thing.
Well, that's the same problem with Rings of Power. I'm like, who is this for? Because you rely on somebody knowing Tolkien to understand it, but you also change so much that anyone that intimately knows Tolkien is almost guaranteed to dislike this. So like, who do you think your target audience is?
Yeah, like I said, I think it would have been way more successful if Galadriel was our only recognizable name and absolutely almost everyone else was made up. I think that would have maybe been a better choice, but we could talk about that all day. So
all night at this point.
All night at this point.
On the having no knowledge of it, but that's not true though. Like it relies on like because you wouldn't understand the Mithril scene. You wouldn't understand. There's so many scenes like that where they just say a name, say a word, say a character name, and it's like dun dun dun. And like unless you know Tolkien, if you just were like
even
lived under
Sauron,
a rock,
Sauron. I mean, do they really explain why he's a threat, or do they expect people to have seen Lord of the Rings, which may be a fair expectation? And I think what the commenter was trying to say, like, if you knew nothing about Tolkien, maybe you would enjoy the show more. And that's where I'm like, that.
I would say that, except like, I don't think it's entertaining and you'd be confused because it does rely on you knowing stuff.
I think if you knew nothing about Tolkien, you would be bored out of your mind. And I say that as someone who knows a lot about Tolkien and is bored out of their minds. So I feel like it could only get worse, but you know, it's hard to tell.
But so like an interesting thing that would make it makes sense why also I mean a better showrunners could make this work for Rings of Power, but the World of Ice and Fire is not one that is like constantly filled with like immortal creatures and deep magic and whatever. Like it's not like that. So like here when you have a prequel story, Galadriel 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, whatever, like is still a character in a much later story, whereas in everyone in the song World of Ice and Fire, they're like human beings with human lifespans. So like if you're telling a story that happens 200 years ago, none of those people is going to be alive for Game of Thrones. Like they're not relevant to it. Like they are as relevant to Game of Thrones as like Queen Victoria is to the present day. Like I don't need to know the present day to understand Queen Victoria, because like she had her own deal and her own political problems back in the day. So like that's what House of the Dragon is like. This is a different era of history. So it had its own problems that have nothing to do with what happened 200 years later.
And no Lord of the Rings adaptation will ever be like that, because you do have to deal with the fact that those people have been around forever. So that is an interesting distinction.
Like the only way you get around that is, again, if you told a story that's just not about those characters that are so prominently featured in Lord of the Rings. If you did something, you know, over here that's like not tied to that so much. But yeah. So yeah, I hope everybody who's going to run a show in the near future watched this stream and learned what makes a good one. So this is your starter kit.
Very specific. So hopefully you're just good at the thing you do. That's it. Be good.
Be good.
And
but also be original.
Yeah, take a person who can say no to you, and don't listen, and don't have a 10,000 cooks in the kitchen, which may not be always their choice, but that would be ideal.
But make sure one of the cooks is us.
Yeah, sure.
Actually, no. We're not the cooks, we're the tasters.
We're the tasters.
We're the tasters.
And we're like, this needs salt. No, I don't even say that.
We bring the salt.
This needs us seasoning, and you decide which one it is. Fix it.
I'm just gonna be like, no, it's not good. Make something else.
Yep, that's it.
Well, thank you for coming on and chatting for the time has flown. It is over 2 hours. I did not quite realize. I realized at like an hour and a half mark, and I thought it had been like a few minutes since the hour and a half mark, and it's past 2 hours now. I'm like,
yeah, thanks, Kyle, for reminding us that we're still here. We'll let you all go now.
Thank you very much for everybody who came by. Thank you, PJ. Yeah, it's a happening conversation. There's so many adaptations.
And there will continue to be more. We can have a part 2 next year and hope that like the 10 that come out in that time period are good.
We're gonna get a second season of Good Omens, which is pure invention. So we'll see if Neil Gaiman can pull it off again. We've been very kind to him during this live, except for Sandman. All right. Well, thanks everybody for hanging out, and go check out Bookborn's channel. She also talks about lots of fantasy books and adaptations. She actually researches stuff, unlike me, who turns on a camera and hopes for the best. So if you want quality content, go
you're
check
funnier,
out Bookborn.
So you just gotta decide.
Sometimes I'm funny if it's a good day.
Literally, the only messages I've been getting before this live was like, oh my gosh, Leanna's Rings of Power videos are so funny. And I'm like, yes, but I know.
I can't take credit for that, because really I just tell you what happened in the episode and the show is dumb.
And then you
so
laugh.
It's funny. So like I can't take credit for that. I just told you what happened. All right. Well, thanks for hanging out, and you will doubtless be back on my channel in the future. So good night, everybody.
We've already got plans for you to be back on my channel. So we'll be there.
We do.